It's funny that many people call LeBron a stat padder, but he made 10 NBA finals. How can he be stat padding? Guys who stat pad wouldn't make that many NBA finals. Exactly, but that's because there's many idiots online who don't really know basketball and just pretend like they know something and spew this crap out. The biggest stat padders are actually Kobe Bryant and Wilt Chamberlain. Kobe is obviously a stat padder. He shoots as many shots as possible, then everybody praises him because he scored all these points in the regular season, all these 50 and 60 point games and that 81 point game. Well, that's because in the regular season he had the green light to chuck as many shots as possible and Phil Jackson let him do it. However, in the playoffs, you don't see Kobe doing any of this, and his playoff scoring average is 19th all time because he's just average in the playoffs. He has a moment here and there, but he's never been consistently great in the playoffs like Jordan and LeBron. Kobe also only averaged over 30 points per game in 1 finals out of 7, shot his team out of 2 finals in 2004 and 2008 and almost a third in 2010 if Gasol didn't save his ass, blew a 3-1 lead in the playoffs in 2006, and never locked up anyone in the playoffs. Yet everyone online thinks Kobe is this amazing clutch player with killer instinct that can score at will, yet they can never give any concrete examples of him doing this in the playoffs and finals because he didn't have any game winners in the finals and no explosive games in the finals, so they have nothing to point to. Only the high-scoring regular season stuff and him sinking 2 free throws on a torn Achilles and acting like it's something superhuman nobody else can do or something. Wilt is the same thing, another huge stat padder that only cared about his numbers. The difference between him and Bill Russell is Bill Russell never cared about his numbers, only about winning. But Wilt's field goal percentage is actually pretty high, and he led the league in field goal percentage most of his career. Wilt's field goal percentage is skewed. His overall shooting percent was brought up from his garbage baskets beside the rim. The garbage baskets he gets are the good stuff and he should keep doing that, but it's his so-called bread and butter post-tournament shots that isn't reliable. He's not very efficient with those. Like when he shoots isolated one-on-one in the post, he's not that efficient and definitely not clutch. But his high percent garbage baskets beings up his overall percent. It wasn't until he got Alex Hannum that coach made him stop taking those one-on-one post turnaround shots and made him focus on garbage baskets around the rim. But isn't that because he had bad teammates around him? Who else would take good shots? There was a while even when he had good teammates and kept doing that. Alex Hannum ran the triangle offense, which forced Wilt to change up his game. Would Wilt have changed his game without that? And the triangle offense forced Wilt to give up the ball and forced him to pass more. And we're not even factoring in the fact that Wilt chokes a lot. Wilt choked a lot against his era's competition, and his one-on-one post game wasn't that effective even during his era when competition was weaker. His post 1vs1 game wasn't even very effective against his own era's competition. But he got a high field goal percent. Doesn't that mean he must have been somewhat effective? Everyone else in his era was more inefficient than him. Did you not hear what I said? You're just looking at percent and getting misleading conclusions. If you watch the games, you can tell how inefficient that shot was. It was like watching Kevin Garnett in Minnesota taking all those ill-advised turnaround jumpers. A great player moves the ball around and gives great shots to his teammates first and only relies on a bad shot as a last resort. Listen, seriously listen. I'm not making assumptions, I'm serious about execution. There's so many times he took those bad shots where he could have worked the ball around to even give someone a layup or wide open shot, but he didn't and took his shot as the first option. And there's no way to get around this, even if we let's say his teammates really did suck so bad and it's pointless to even pass the ball to them, which is not true, but let's say we assume that even then his one-on-one post game still isn't nearly as good or dominant as Kareem, Shaq, Hakeem, and that's a fact. He's not as nearly as good in the post one-on-one as those guys. His shots aren't as varied or efficient there, and now we're going to say he's an earlier player and give him the benefit of a doubt, which is not fair to players that came later that were better like Kareem. Kareem was a newer player, but also we can't just give older guys a free pass just because they were older. Was George Mikan great for his time? Sure. But there's people who overinflate all the old guys and romanticize them and put them on a pedestal, acting like he created the hook shot. When I first played basketball, not having watched any NBA game, I did a hook shot because it was just a natural movement. If the guy is on your back, of course you can hook the shot. People overinflate the importance of older players, saying Mikan created the hook shot or saying there's no Hakeem or Shaq if not for that guy. Sure, those players are newer and have benefit of modern training, but they also play against better competition too. Tougher competition, hence why they are better. Modern players were chosen amongst a tougher group. So Wilt had the benefit of playing against weaker competition. And he wasn't dominant one-on-one against that competition. Like if he was dominating like Shaq or Kareem one-on-one in the post during that era, that's something to talk about, but his one-on-one post game wasn't as dominant as theirs, even vs that era's competition, cause the newer guys were dominating against their competition. Duncan dominated KG. Shaq dominated Duncan. Hakeem dominated Shaq. And they were efficient. But problem with Wilt is that one-on-one post game wasn't nearly as dominant as theirs even vs his own era when it counted. So you're saying that season Wilt averaged 50 points per game and did it on 50% efficiency. Most of those points were easy garbage time baskets and not from one-on-one against other players? See, now you're lowering things to the stats again. We already agreed it was because of his era. Faster pace, more rebounds, more possessions, more garbage baskets, more garbage putbacks. Those garbage putbacks padded his field goal percentage to make up for his mediocre one-on-one post game. Those are the things you can only notice when you watch and analyze the actual games. If you actually played basketball you would know this. If I was the coach I'd tell him to stop taking all these one-on-one post shots unless there's no other option left and time is running out, and don't take any turnaround jumpers, just rotate to the rim to shoot it. But first, before that, catch the ball in the post, drop it off on the pass to encourage your teammates to move and cut and start getting the team moving, so you be a fake post threat catch and give, then rotate and screen. This encourages your teammates to move and not stand, and they will make an extra pass and try to get easier layups and open shots first as a team. Then if there's nothing, you can take that stupid shot anytime when there's no time left, and the rest of the time roll and focus on rebound and easy garbage putbacks. That's the proper way to play with his game, and that's what he eventually did after getting Hanum as a coach. Yes, we can talk about 50 points a game, but a lot of those were also from the high percent garbage putbacks. But when he's taking those one-on-one post shots as the team's first option, it's not going anywhere cause he's very mediocre with those shots. In the history of the game, most players, even many modern players, were mediocre with those shots, like Kevin Garnett. If you're a big man, if you take those weird turnaround jumpers, sure, you can get the shot off anytime, doesn't mean it's a good idea. Most players when doing that can get the shot off, but it's not a good shot and doesn't help the team. Doesn't help you get back into rebounding position either. Kevin Garnett did that in Minnesota and it padded his stats but got him nowhere. You can't win jack shit in the playoffs doing that. And people who said Garnett had more moves than Duncan are idiots. Duncan had more moves in the post. KG just had that turnaround jumper and that's it. Duncan had a post turnaround, a face up and drive to the basket, an up and under, drop step, hook. Duncan had all the counters. That's why you defend him one way, he'll counter with the other move. He's perfect fundamentally. KG only had two moves: the face up spot up mid-range shot and a post turnaround. And KG sure had a high field goal percentage just like Wilt, which is why looking at stats alone doesn't tell anything close to the whole story. And KG in Boston changed up his game just like Wilt did and stopped doing that stupid post one-on-one shit and focused on taking wide open jumpers and putbacks, which is what he should be doing. So his game is more about himself. KG when he was in Minnesota doesn't really work the ball around and doesn't open up the game enough for his team. Duncan's game, he gives up the ball when he should. He will let his team execute first and then he will do his post thing if the team needs it. And Duncan is also super smart. He moves without the ball and rolls, always doing something. Even without the ball he's moving, positioning. That's what KG and a lot of other guys don't do. Duncan would give up the ball early, let his teams cut and move the ball around. Duncan doesn't even need to get the assist stat himself. He gives up the ball to the right player and that player then moves the ball to someone else, and it allows his team to get more open shots even though he's not the recipient of the assist. And keep in mind, when looking at assists, you can be selfish with assists too. A casual will just look up a player's assist and says, oh, he gets 7 assists a game, so he's unselfish and moves the ball, which isn't always the case. There's a lot of selfish assists too, like players who would hold the ball in their hand forever and they will never pass unless it's to a player who has an open shot. Like they won't just give up the ball to someone early even though that person isn't shooting cause they want the assist, so they only give it up when they see someone is open and they will shoot it. TJ Ford was like this. Jason Williams was like this. Plus White Chocolate was a terrible shooter, hence why the Kings didn't get anywhere until they traded him for Mike Bibby, who was a much better player basketball IQ wise. Hence why I mean looking at stats is pointless, and that's why when you see players who play in the triangle offense, normally no player on the team dominates in assist, even though the triangle is a passing offense, but no one player will dominate on the assist stat cause everyone just gives up the ball early and moves the ball. It's not one player hogging the ball and only passing when he knows that person has to shoot. With guys who are selfish in assists, and Wilt was like this too one year when he tried to lead the league in assists. He never passes the ball until he knows someone has to shoot it, so everyone is just standing around waiting for him to either pass or shoot, and ball movement is completely stunted. Guys like Scottie Pippen, Tim Duncan, Bill Walton, they aren't looking to get the assist stat, they are looking to where their teammates are a couple of passes later, like a hockey assist. So there's a huge difference in KG and Duncan's game. KG didn't have the basketball IQ Duncan has. Guys like him and Wilt only became useful when they toned down the 1vs1 shit and focused on other stuff like rebounding, setting picks, open shots, garbage putbacks, and letting the team execute without them. When they were doing the one-on-one shit, it wasn't as dominant as guys like Kareem or Shaq or Hakeem. Those guys, when they decide to go one-on-one, they can take you to the finals and maybe win a title. That's what made them special. They had the basketball IQ to work the ball around along with the 1vs1 dominance. So they chose when to do it, making them even more dangerous. Shaq learned it later until Phil, because his one-on-one was already so dominant he can almost win the title with his one-on-one alone, but once he learned under Phil to also work the ball and pass. Give it up early, and there's one stat that's very telling. The Lakers back then had a higher winning percent when Shaq played and Kobe was out than when Kobe played and Shaq was out. Kobe fans will keep arguing they were equal and needed each other, but if you actually watch the games, they were better when Kobe was out and only Shaq was playing. A lot of people online only say they watched the games but didn't really pay attention or analyze the games. It's like your friend who said that Reggie Miller always torched the Bulls and was underrated and was better than Patrick Ewing. He definitely didn't watch any basketball games and probably saw a couple of YouTube highlights. He saw Reggie hit that one game winner over Jordan in the playoffs on YouTube, and it's a series that the Bulls won. Reggie was shut down the entire series besides that one shot. He saw a Reggie Miller documentary on YouTube showing Reggie's hot game vs the Knicks, and he thinks that Reggie always beat the Knicks, but he didn't realize that the Knicks were almost always the better team than the Pacers until the late 90s. The Knicks were the Bulls' main rival after the Bulls beat the bad boy Pistons. For the early to mid-90s the Knicks were better than the Pacers, and only towards the late 90s did the Pacers become a threat. So it was only in 1998 that the Pacers started giving the Bulls trouble, and that was the weakest Bulls championship team, and they still beat the Pacers in 7 games. Jordan had an injured shooting finger and Pippen had back spasms and injuries the whole year. Jerry Krause also got rid of all their big men to try and sabotage them. Krause got rid of Jason Caffey and Dickie Simpkins. 1997 was the best team of the second three-peat because they had Bison Dealey, and Jordan was in better shape in 1997. People say 1996 was the best Bulls team because they only go by the win-loss record. But 1997 was the better team. Jordan was in top form and Bison Dealey was an improvement in the center spot. So where did you watch all these games back then? Presumably you never saw Wilt live since the games were in the 1960s. I watched ESPN Hardwood Classics games when I was a kid and remember in detail every game that Wilt played, so don't question me. Wilt took a lot of bad shots even though his field goal percentage might overall be very high. A lot of sports fans lie. Just like about the Barry Bonds thing, making stats up because they want to discredit Shohei Ohtani. Shohei Ohtani is much better than Babe Ruth because Babe Ruth played in an era where the league was segregated and some of the best black players back then like Josh Gibson couldn't even play in the MLB, and also the pitching speed was far slower back then. Compared to basketball, perhaps baseball hasn't evolved as much as basketball has, but batters now definitely are batting against way faster pitches. On average, players now are also way more fit than before too. So at least these are objective. The average pitching speed back then was maybe around 75 miles per hour. The average now is like 96 miles per hour and goes into a bit over 100 miles per hour, so it's a totally different level. And another big reason why I'd say a lot of players now aren't talked about as much unless you're really into the sport is because baseball is also way less popular now than it is before. However, the athletes on average are definitely better. It's like in boxing, there's good boxers nowadays, especially in the midweight and lighter, but they don't get talked about as much cause boxing isn't that popular now. Like Naoto Inoue is objectively the greatest boxer ever to come out in the middleweight and lighter. From a technical analysis standpoint, he's objectively better than Manny Pacquiao, but Manny is much more popular cause boxing was more popular back then and fighters were more heavily marketed. But yeah, in terms of baseball overall, athletes now are better for sure. Will any classic players make a top 10 overall? Cause the difference in what the players are facing is pretty big. It's a huge difference batting against 75 miles per hour vs batting against 100 miles per hour, and some of these guys like Ohtani are hitting the ball at distances and speeds unheard of, and against 96 to over 100 miles per hour pitching speeds. Ohtani is a true two-way great player who can truly pitch and bat at an absolute all-time elite grade level. Babe Ruth, a large part of his two-way play was actually overhyped because Ruth wasn't that great of a pitcher, and he actually quit pitching once the rules got harder against pitchers. He only pitched when it was like the dead ball era, when pitching was easy and it was very hard for batters. It was the era when rules favored pitchers, and also the stadiums were way larger those few years, so it was very hard to batters to hit home runs. But once the stadiums became more standardized and rules changed, he stopped pitching and barely actually pitched and batted at a high level in the same season, so the pitching part for him is quite overhyped. Ohtani was doing both at all-time elite levels for longer, and Ohtani pitches over 100 miles per hour, and also on average a pro pitcher, even a superstar in modern times, might really only have 2 great pitches and maybe 1 or 2 other okay usable pitches, maybe a fastball or curveball and then a so-so slider and change-up. Ohtani actually has 6 or 7 elite pitches while pitching at over 100 miles per hour, and also he's very clutch, like how he struck out Mike Trout in the World Baseball Classic Finals last possession. He pitched 2 straight over 100 mile per hour pitches in the clutch. Mike Trout even had to nod in agreement. So pitching-wise, Ruth was never in the same stratosphere as Ohtani or modern great pitches. And for batting, let's just look at what Ohtani is doing. So he had 2 surgeries on his elbow from pitching, and this past off-season he had another major elbow surgery, hence why he didn't pitch this year. A normal baseball athlete with such a surgery is one of the biggest surgeries in baseball and would be out of Comey's for a whole season at least in order to recover. Otani after his surgery not only didn't take the season off but became the best batter in his league, hitting the ball to places no one thought possible while he's nursing an injured elbow. He turned himself into maybe the best batter in the world while injured when most players would be out for the year, and this is versus modern pitching. And let's also recognize he's also super fit and trim. I mean, he's a modern athlete with Japanese work ethic, so he's got a super fit body, can run like a deer, and he's 6'4". I mean, we all know Ruth wasn't exactly fit, so he wasn't in the same universe. Pitching now is just so much faster, it's actually become a problem because pitching in the last 14 years alone has improved too much already. In the past 12 to 14 years alone, the average MLB pitching speed went from like 92 miles per hour to 96 miles per hour, which is huge, so pitching is getting too good now, making it hard to hit, which actually makes baseball hard to watch for casuals now unless you're a purist who loves defense and stuff. I love pitching, so I personally enjoy it, but I can see how the casuals would hate it because nobody is hitting, so yeah, Otani and these great batters now are doing it against this type of modern pitching, so yeah, it does really put into perspective just the level of athlete we have now in modern sports. Another big thing to recognize is back then in classic era there was much more segregation, so players back then not only were playing against easier pitches and also it wasn't as international. Nowadays you're going up against literally the best competition in the world. The best white, black, Latino, Japanese players all playing against each other. It's not just you're playing against the best white players in the USA, so the level of competition now is just much higher. It's like what I mentioned about hockey, how Wayne Gretzky's era in the 80s was before the big influx of Euro and Russian players. On average, Russian and Euro hockey players are much more skilled skaters. Faster and more skilled skaters. Even the defensemen from Europe and Russia were much more skilled and faster and nimble. In the 80s the defensemen skaters who were American and Canadians were known to be shitty skaters and slow, so the level of competition that Mario Lemieux has to go against in the 90s was way different. 90s was when the big incoming of Euro and Russian skaters happened. Fast, skilled defensemen. So it's the same theme with baseball. You're going up against the best of the entire world now. Also, we have to recognize it's not just a black player is allowed and after that it's open. It's a gradual thing. Where gradually more and more other races were in, so even after Jackie Robinson it took decades and decades till more and more races got in. Hell, even the Japan CC players playing in MLB is a relatively new thing, with Ichiro doing it like 12-15 years ago, so the playing field now is just much more open and competition. We all know Japanese players are no joke, just this influx of Japanese players has opened the world's eyes. How disciplined they are, fundamentally perfect, how hard they work, and they're clutch and they're coming, and it's gradually getting more, which is what I mean by even Asians playing are a relatively new thing. Off the top of my head I can think of about 10 Japanese players in the MLB, so there's probably more. So yeah. The level of competition now is so high. Like back in 2009 the world's eyes were opened seeing Japan vs Korea. How fundamentally sound and disciplined both teams were. That Asian brand of baseball. Discipline, fundamentals, smarts, strategic contact, motion, offense. Even what the rest of the world saw in 2009 from Japan and Korea has changed the way baseball is being played strategically now, cause back then in 2009 the Asians didn't have the home run hitting power, so they made up for it with strategy, self-sacrifice, motion offense, trying to get on plate with contact hits, or bunts to sacrifice for another teammate to move up the plate, just always thinking, instead of just going for home runs and playing super fundamental defense. The rest of the world actually was surprised then. Korea now isn't as good as before, but Japan now they still play just as smart, strategic, disciplined, but they have the heavy home run hitters and power hitters too now to go along with all that, hence why they won the last World Baseball Classic. That last Japan World team in the 2023 World Baseball Classic was like the 1992 Dream Team. They had all-time great pitchers. Otani, Darvish, and a couple of other phenoms. Two of these guys can pitch over 100 miles per hour. And they had all the great fundamental defensemen, and they now also have great power hitters, Otani, Murakami, Okamoto, Yamamoto, and some others, and they have great smart contact hitters, Jonda and others, and they all sacrifice for each other and aren't worried about stats. Back in the day for Americans, if you're an ace hitter most likely you won't sacrifice yourself and your stats to bunt the ball and allow a fellow teammate on the plate to run, cause they'll rather go for the home run or a big hit. If you bunt most likely you will get out before the first place, but you allow your teammate to advance to the second or third plate. The Japanese do that. Their heavy hitters will sacrifice their stats to bunt if needed, and a lot of these Japanese players now, the great ones like Murakami, the MLB are all salivating to sign these guys, but they have a rule in Japan where you need to be a certain age before they go to MLB, so unless you just skip the Japan League as an 18-year-old, and then MLB teams have to pay millions to the Japanese team that owns his rights, but it's well worth it for MLB teams. They're all poaching Japanese talent now. Now equipment-wise I think the bats aren't really different because all the modern metal bats are banned from pro leagues and you can still only use a solid wood bat. Even bamboo bats aren't legal in pros cause bamboo isn't pure solid wood, but yeah, one piece of solid wood might be different in terms of the turn pattern but probably won't make too much difference there, but in terms of equipment the bigger difference is in the gloves. Of course the gloves got standardized after a point and hasn't changed, but legal wise there's a limit to what weight is allowed in the pros, so even that's not too much different. Pros are strong, they just use the same weights usually. I don't even think drop 3 is allowed or used in pros. After drop 3 it's just standard weight, which is what pros use. So yeah, I don't think equipment in baseball is much different. Glove technology hasn't changed for 40 or 50 years and bats are about the same for pros. For us amateurs the bats are better because we use the metal bats, but pros are still using a solid piece of wood and it has to be solid the same as before. Just athletes now are just better, which is normal. Pitchers are throwing faster, batters are hitting harder and more accurate, people more fit, etc. And yeah, definitely way more competition now since it's international in the past 24 years or so, with more world tournaments. Also easier for scouts and GMs to poach international talent into the MLB, cause when you watch international competition now you see how these international players are doing vs MLB talent, like say when Japan faces USA, then you can see how good these foreign players really are. Which also helped a lot in bringing all these international players into the league in the past 20 years. And speaking of gloves, I'm still breaking in my Mizuno leather glove. It's Japanese leather made of high-quality steer hide kip leather and is hard as a rock, so I need a long time to break in. See, Japanese really know their leather, they know how to use the right leather in the right places. For the Japanese molten basketball I got, the leather is already broken in and ready to play. For baseball gloves they use harder leather, forcing you to play more to break it in first. So I've been playing catch for the past few weeks to break it in more. So why do you need an expensive baseball glove if you are just playing catch? An expensive baseball glove is way more necessary for catch than in a game because you are using it way more in catch. It's much harder on the hand because I'm catching every 5 seconds for hours. I even injured my index finger yesterday because of all the catching, so a good glove is important for catch. Good thing I bought the slightly cheaper Rawlings mid for my cousin because the Mizuno outfield glove leather takes too long to break in because it's so high quality, hence not ready to play for them. The Mizuno glove feels like a fossilized rock, goes to show Mizuno just gives you the real deal and lets you deal with the rest. But Shohei is not only an all-time great pitcher striking out Mike Trout at the 2023 World Baseball Classic, but he is also the first player in MLB history to record over 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases in a season. And the only player ever to win MVP as just the designated hitter, cause he couldn't play defense due to his injury, and yet he still pulled off a historic season. And you see, the first season he comes to the LA Dodgers despite being injured and not being able to pitch, they make the playoffs and win the World Series. It's like with LeBron, when LeBron goes to any new team within 2 years they get a title. With this Dodgers team, the same team choked badly the past 3 years and lost each year and choked even though there was talent on the team. The first series versus the Padres, which went to 5 games, in Game 1 the Dodgers looked scared like they're choking again, and the Dodgers were down by 3 or 4 runs and it was Ohtani who hit a big home run to tie the game for them and changed that game, otherwise they could have easily lost Game 1. Next round, same thing. Team looked really uptight and was down by 1 and Ohtani hits another home run to tie the game, and the finals was the same. Dodgers looked uptight and was down by 1 near the end of the game, and Ohtani hits a big hit and runs 3 bases and gets to third base and eventually scores a run to tie the game near the end and bring it to overtime, and then overtime Freddie Freeman hit a legendary grand slam to win. Ohtani though tore his shoulder in Game 3 of the finals, and although he played Game 4 and 5 he wasn't the same anymore. Aaron Judge sucks, he's just a regular season guy. So far his whole career he's choked in the playoffs. He's never done anything in the playoffs. His stats in the playoffs the last few years are worse than many scrubs. Judge also choked in the 5th inning of the final game, which led to the Dodgers coming back from a 0-5 deficit that inning to tie it. It's funny how some people say Ohtani sucks and Judge is the best when Judge has so far choked in every playoffs he's been in. This year playoffs Dodgers have been injured. Freeman was their third best player and was also injured but still playing. They lost 60% of their pitchers, so certain games when they couldn't play Yamamoto they would struggle cause they have no other leading pitchers. Buller just came off of surgery and almost didn't make the playoff roster, so on some days when they couldn't use Yamamoto cause he played the last game they had to go deep into their bullpen using backup pitchers, which made some games really tough. Next year if Ohtani is healthy and pitching again along with batting and all the other pitchers are back, it'll be scary. Hopefully Ohtani can still pitch well after surgery cause he had surgery on that elbow twice. Because baseball has such a long history, it dates back to the era when the East Coast of the USA was much more developed than the West Coast. So back then teams like New York Yankees and other Eastern teams will have way more titles because Western teams weren't developed back then. To put it into perspective, the average pitching I saw this playoffs from the top pitchers average about 94 to 96 miles per hour on their fastballs, and when someone pitches 98 or 99 it's nuts. And I've only ever seen that happen a few times in the playoffs. Before the injury, when Ohtani was pitching to finish off the World Championships versus Trout, He pitched 2 or 3 straight 100-mile-per-hour pitches in the clutch for the world title, just a one-run game. And Trout is one of the 3 best hitters of the MLB. Trout had no chance vs those 100 miles per hour pitches Otani was throwing. I don't think I saw anyone throw 100 or more this playoff run, so imagine next year if Otani's pitching is back on track too. This Dodgers team will be scary. And another thing is, baseball doesn't really have much of a salary cap, and Otani is willing to defer 90% of all his money until over 10 years later so the team can have more money to sign better players to win, and now Dodgers have officially become the MLB team of Japan. So a lot of top Japanese stars has a solid chance of going to Dodgers in the future. Yamamoto already went to Dodgers because of Otani, and Yamamoto was huge too this year. In the final Game 7 vs Padres do or die, Yamamoto pitched a perfect game and kept Padres scoreless for like 5 or 6 innings. Then for Game 2 vs Yankees he pitched another almost perfect game. Scary thing is Dodgers just signed Sasaki now too. He's only 23 and he's a megastar in Japan for his Japan team. Normally they can only get released to MLB when 25 and after, and at that point the MLB team have to pay them veteran money, so a max contract, which is a lot of money, like 400 million to 700 million contracts, but Sasaki just wants the competition. The money isn't that important to him. That shows you Japanese people aren't greedy like Western people. They don't care about the money as much, it's more about their passion. Just like with video games back in the day, Japanese video games all high quality and they put all the effort into the design and gameplay, while Western gaming companies flood the market with cheap shitty licensed games, and even their big budget titles are filled with bugs and ship you an empty shell of a game that they milk you with DLC and microtransactions because they are greedy and all about making money. It's the same thing with modern Hollywood films and TV shows. If it's a success they will keep milking it like no tomorrow. Keep the series going as long as you can until no one likes it anymore. Marvel movies? Keep pumping them out. Star Wars? Sequel trilogy already killed it dead, but let's keep milking the dead cow. Fast and Furious, how many are they on now? Western companies think too much about dollars and profits and how make customers and less about the craftsmanship. During COVID-19 most Japanese CEOs and executives took pay cuts so they can keep the lower level employees employed. There's an honor system and all about relationships there. Western companies on the other hand use the opportunity to increase their prices as much as possible and use COVID as an excuse to justify the price increase along with inflation, and then once they hired extra employees to keep up with increase in demand during COVID they lay them all off after COVID and kept the big fat paychecks for their executives. So you see how Japanese mentality is different. Sasaki went into an agreement with his Japanese team to let him go at the age of 23, but thing is, he's losing a lot of money himself doing it this way, and so is his Japanese team. At 23. He can be signed to a super cheap rookie contract for the next 5 years, so not a max superstar contract. If he waited just 2 more years he'd get a max long-term superstar contract, but he wanted to play against the best early, so he chose to come at 23 years old, and now he's just making rookie level money for the next 4 or 5 years maybe. And the thing is, his Japan team is losing a lot of money allowing him to leave early, cause the rules is when an MLB team takes a Japan player, that MLB team also has to pay that Japan team a % of the contract they are giving that Japanese player. So say if the Japan team releases Sasaki at age 25 instead, then he gets a max contract of 500 to 700 million, the Japan team might be entitled to about 20% of that, which is at least $100 million, which is huge. But by releasing Sasaki early now at 23 his Japan team might only get maybe less than 10 million, so his Japan team is also losing a lot of money by releasing him early, on top of losing their superstar player, which of course affects the team's popularity in Japan too. But Sasaki and his team probably has some under-the-table honor system where Sasaki probably promises to give the team a lot of money from his future max deals in the future, like outside of any legal contract. So I'm pretty sure Sasaki pretty much will make sure he'll take care of his old Japan team under the table in the long future. That's probably why Sasaki was holding out a bit longer to wait for teams to scrap up an extra 1 or 2 million. I think he's actually giving that extra money back to his Japan team. So yeah. For sure these Japanese players who are able to make it to the MLB early, they have an honor system to help take care of their old Japanese team financially, but here in the US you have Carlos Boozer screwing over the Cavaliers owner after they had a handshake deal. And that's Sasaki, one of my favorite pitchers. Another year later Murakami might enter the MLB too, and Murakami is the best batter in Japan League right now. There's a chance Dodgers might get him too. The thing is, in baseball there's no hard salary cap, so teams like the Yankees can just stack up on the best players in the league. MLB can be very top-heavy cause of the soft salary cap. Yankees had more depth at pitching this year cause of Dodgers injuries, and Yankees had Judge, Stanton, Soto, and all 3 are max salary stars, and their pitchers, a couple of them are max salary guys too. Yankees historically were able to stack up like this since they had the money. After those 3 batting stars they have a bunch of very good semi-stars too. For Dodgers only Yamamoto has a max pitching contract. It's funny when you watch Asian vs American players. The American guys are big and sort of fat on defense, some of them have bad habits and they are slower or more lazy on the run to catch the ball. In the World Championships when you see Japan, they run like their life depended on it to catch the balls. They'll run and dive and shit. Like versus Yankees quite a few times, those big Yankee guys just didn't hustle much on defense and a Japanese player would have gotten to that fly ball. Like in 5th inning in last game, Yankees up by 5 runs, it was 0-5, looks like Yankees should win and they choked in the 5th. Aaron Judge started it all by choking and missed an easy fly ball catch which would have been an out, but he fumbled the catch and that helped Dodgers load the bases, and then Yankees star pitcher forced Mookie Betts to hit a ground ball. The ground ball went to first base and the pitcher didn't do the fundamentally sound thing where he should run over to cover first base cause the first baseman was busy trying to retrieve the ball, so the pitcher in this case should run over to cover the first base for him, but the Yankees pitcher was too lazy to, so he didn't run to cover first base and started pointing the finger at the first baseman who was trying to retrieve the ball to run back to first base to get Betts out, but of course he can't, and what would have been another cut for the Dodgers turned into a run instead. And what would have been another out for Dodgers turned into a run instead, and Betts made the base. Really lazy ass. The fundamental way to play is even if you can see your first baseman has time to catch the ball and get back to first base himself, you as the pitcher should still always run to first base too, just in case you need to help cover, just as a safety thing. These are fundamentals, not cutting corners. Like you see Yamamoto every time, even though for sure the first baseman looks like he can retrieve the ball and get back to base himself, Yamamoto still runs like crazy towards first base just in case he needs to cover. The difference in discipline and fundamentals is pretty big. Japanese players don't cut corners like when Otani pitches. If outfield needs to throw back to home plate, Otani as the pitcher would actually run all the way back to home base to be behind his catcher to support him. That's a lost art now. People don't do that here in MLB anymore, but Otani was doing that all during the World Championships and the American commentators were like, whoa. That's a lost art. But yeah, this Dodgers team though really did choke really bad the past 3 years straight in the playoffs, so Otani really did help get them over the hump. Just his massive regular season to help them get number 1 was already huge. I mean, one of my favorite international players, Kawamura, made the NBA finally, but he's more like Magic Johnson than he is Steph Curry. So you just got back from Japan, right? How was it? See any interesting video games or video game consoles that you wanted? Not really. I did like the Neo Geo back in the day because it was the only home console that was literally arcade perfect, because it was the same components that SNK used in their arcade cabinets, just adapted for home console, but it was too expensive so none of my buddies could afford it. There was the Neo Geo Pocket, but there's no point playing handhelds because they are just so far off from the original game, they are just different games. Like fighting games on a handheld, even if they had micro switches like the Neo Geo Pocket, will always be a sub-par experience because they are just different games adapted to handheld, and the number of buttons changed from 6 buttons to 2 is way too much, so those aren't even arcade ports. They are just different games. At least with Super Nintendo the ports were reasonable, they still kept the 6 buttons and watered down the graphics a bit, but it was still the same game for the most part, but not for handhelds. Those handheld games are not ports, they are not even the same game as the arcade versions. And sure, the Neo Geo had the micro switch thumbstick, which is nice, but for games back then that bad was fine, cause back then fighting games were the dominant genre, so pads for Nintendo and PlayStation were all really good and I never missed a beat with them. But Neo Geo Pocket wasn't a good product because the library was almost exclusively SNK, and if you're an SNK fanboy then you want to have something more true to the arcades, and dumbing down their games to just 2 buttons and changing the graphics so much wouldn't have been appealing to any SNK fan. SNK fans would just go to the arcade instead, and nobody back then could afford the full-size Neo Geo console either, so it's no wonder both the Neo Geo home console or handheld failed. Neo Geo, the issue was the games alone cost like $200 or $300 back then. But arcade gaming was the holy grail back then, so having an arcade perfect console like Neo Geo is mind-blowing, however the cost was stupid. Well, I'm sure there's people out there who are into games that are not arcade games like simulation or RPG or adventure games, and other consoles had those, but Neo Geo seems focused only on action games or arcade ports. Arcade and action games in general was a huge part of the market. You don't understand because you didn't grow up during the time when arcades were big. Simulation games was a very small part of the market back then, extremely small. Home console RPGs only gained steam from the mid-90s in the West, but for the most part RPGs were more popular in Japan. Even for console-only games the vast majority of games were action games. Castlevania and Mega Man for example were console-only but still action games. Whether arcade or not, action games were the most popular by far back then. However, arcades were known as the place to go to witness the latest and greatest technology before we know watered-down ports or copycats will come to console later. Side-scrolling, platformer, racing, fighting, puzzle, shooter, beat 'em up, these were the main genres back then, and Neo Geo had all these. Just as a gamer back then, to be able to get arcade perfect for all these genres is something awesome beyond belief that we wouldn't have dreamed it. Too good to be true. However, it's just the price was so prohibitive. So everyone who plays Mario and Zelda would drop it in a heartbeat to play arcade perfect games is what you're saying. I didn't say that, but it will definitely steal market share because gamers were getting older. The 80s crop of gamers were becoming teenagers and more complicated and complex fighting games were more popular in the 90s. Beat 'em ups were pretty much the evolution of platformers due to that extra plane you go moving up and down. Gamers outgrew Nintendo. That's why when Nintendo decided to stick to cartridge and make all those kiddie games for the N64, me and all my friends jumped to the PlayStation because that's where all the mature titles were. We outgrew Mario and Sonic. But yeah, the latest and greatest were all in arcades back then, and the watered down ports would come to consoles later, sort of like how you went to the cinema for the latest and greatest films and then wait 8 months for the VHS home release to come out later. And of course the original Nintendo couldn't do close to arcade perfect, and even Super Nintendo wasn't able to do arcade perfect either. Final Fight, they dropped co-op in the Super Nintendo port, and when they brought it back for Final Fight 2 and 3 they had to water down the graphics a lot. Back then though, internationally action games were the main genre. Beat 'em up, fighting, shooters, drivers, sports, platformers. RPGs were a smaller market internationally and most weren't even translated back then, since it takes more time and work to translate those, but with action games it's faster and cheaper to localize. But yeah, the reason why we didn't buy Neo Geo back then wasn't because it didn't have enough RPGs or strategy games, it's because of the price. Funny thing is, originally the console was designed for businesses and not for home use. It was designed to sell to businesses like bars where space is limited, so the bar can buy the console for customers to play when drinking, hence why it's power and why it's arcade perfect. It was never designed for home consumption originally, and that's why back in the day no regular retailers carried it, and even game magazines didn't advertise it that much cause they never intended to sell it to gamers for home use directly. So unlike 3DO and Jaguar, there was never any ads for Neo Geo in game magazines early on, and only when SNK realized there's a nice home market then you started to see ads. But yeah, other than that I played Capcom Dungeons and Dragons Shadow over Mysteria again and beat it on 1 credit, and I went to this hole in the wall super small 3-floor house turned into an arcade. The best fighting game tournament players in Yokohama went, and everyone is playing Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Found some really good competition here. Was splitting games with the best Ken player here. Everyone was surprised since I'm not Japanese. The Ken player then later disappeared for a while and bought me this custom-made Ryu as a gift. Made by a local Yokohama guy. That Ken player I played against in Yokohama was apparently top 3 Ken in Tokyo. All the greats here and most people here are better than Daigo in Street Fighter 2 since Daigo plays the new games now. These guys play and practice Street Fighter 2 exclusively. You seem to be pretty into Street Fighter 2, right? I'm just curious about the competition, and playing against the best in the world is fun. I'm not that into it because I don't play it much anymore and haven't been serious in 20 years. These guys are into it much more than me. For gameplay mechanics you just gotta see where I'm coming from, like I pick up a King of Fighters game to play and just in one instant I might have to judge if the other character is executing a fireball. What type of fireball should I use? Forward down forward to execute a perfect timing power dunk to go over or counter or hit on the way down, or counter with my fireball then bait or parry and link to quarter circle counter to quick roll time to link to a 3-hit combo, like the stuff you can do and execute and need to think and decide among so many variables along with more complex execution, and then going to a game where it's roll and then hack. Yes, it's still gameplay focused, but just the level of complexity isn't there, of course. Like Capcom Dungeons and Dragons Shadow over Mysteria, Beat 'em Up, and Alien vs Predator, both these games added the quarter circle movement special move, so when playing say Dungeons and Dragons, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of variables. Say in one instant I need to judge cause AI keeps wanting to surround me and I'm like, this enemy uses a long spike and the other one surrounding me chucks projectiles. I can use my quarter circle slide special move. It's like doing a fireball motion but with kick, so I can execute a slide, and depending on distance I can either long press or short tap to execute a long or short slide and slide to one side and slip under the projectile just before it hits me, and then it'll slide under the projectile, get to the enemy that chucked it, and that enemy might be vulnerable for a split second. Hack once and use the long press slide so all the enemies are now to one side of me. I hack then combo into a fireball motion slash to knock him into the other enemies. Cause the fire all slash knocks enemies back. If I combo right, then suddenly someone on the far end chucks another projectile, so I combo again into a dragon punch style move to try to get into the air to go over it, or I can cut my combo short, end the combo early after the fireball motion slash knockdown, and instead do a quick fireball slide to evade that project 2 to propel forward to now attack that end of the screen. And even FromSoft games don't have this level of complexity, and there's no 3D games that really have this level of complexity where you need to execute motions to do special moves like a fighting game. Like Dynasty Warriors 3 is very similar to say a modern game like Elden Ring. Its base gameplay isn't too complicated, a light attack and a hard attack and you can combo it, but it's the nice scale and difficulty balance and design and co-op that makes Dynasty Warriors 3 special. However, Elden Ring is still a great game even though I wish the gameplay mechanics was more complex. But yeah, the greatness of Capcom Dungeons and Dragons Shadow over Mysteria is, for example, the reverse gravity spell doesn't work on the Lich cause the Lich floats. People who don't understand the depth and complexity of this game because they probably just spammed unlimited credits and pressed one button. There's an inventory system and an equipment system where you wear gear along with your inventory items and 2 spell wheels through the game. It's choose your own path with random item drops. Say if I'm the warrior I can't cast spells naturally, I need to find and collect rings to cast spells. Some bosses later on it's good if I use some magic rings like the ghost thing, but others it's good to use burning oil, and some it's good to use melee or a mixture. I can equip items like the fire rod, lightning rod, ice rod, and each will enhance my skills. So if I want to stock up on lightning rings to use on the ghost and naga, I can choose to equip a lightning rod to enhance the damage, but if I wanted to use a fire ring to cast fireball or use burning oil, then I can use fire rod, and then there's another slot where I can choose to equip earrings to enhance my magic damage or bracelet to enhance melee. And all the bosses have weaknesses and immunities and strengths. Some bosses are immune to fire. The ghost for example has a weakness to lightning. Like there's so much depth and fine tuning, so it comes down to a lot of decisions, and say as the mage I'll have to decide lightning works well for ghost but not dragon, cause dragon's head can move up or fly off screen and lightning I shoot in a straight line. But Capcom designed it so that when casting lightning versus dragon I need to be on the same horizontal plane shooting straight, cause we can angle the lightning bolt if we want, but Capcom designed it so that the lightning bolt only works straight on the dragon, so we can't exploit it, but for the ghost it's better to attack at an angle to hit other enemies. There's so much fine detail and fine tuning in the great classic games. Modern developers will find it mind-boggling that the spells are all fine-tuned and works in different situations, unlike say a modern beat-em-up like Shredder's Revenge where you can just spam that one super move and it works on everything and you don't need to worry about saving it cause it recharges. In Shadow over Mystara I need to decide and plan out my whole path cause random spells can drop for me to stack, so say if this playthrough for some reason if I'm able to collect more elemental spells then I might not want to use those spells too early, cause the rule is each time you level, which is only at certain points in the game, can I replenish spells, so you need to remember in this long choose your path game which bosses are coming up and also at which points do you level up to replenish spells, and then from that you decide what items and spells to use at what time. Like if you deplete all your lightning and elemental or ice storm at an earlier boss but you don't replenish spells there, then you get to the ghost and you're left with just reverse gravity, then you're dead cause reverse gravity doesn't work on the ghost since it floats. Should have used reverse gravity first on the earlier boss if you were in trouble instead and saved lightning and elemental for the ghost. That's the fine tuning and depth I'm talking about, but you only learn all this stuff if you play these old arcade games the right way with limited credits. When your goal is to finish the game with 1 credit, then you have to learn all these intricacies in the game, and only then do you know how well designed it is. If I spam unlimited credits then you can't tell the differences, so a lot of these casual modern players and reviewers have no idea the depth and difference in level design cause they probably just kept spamming continues and pressing the same button. And on a side note, if I ever got to that situation with the ghost where I use up all my lightning, elemental, and ice storm before the ghost, which will never happen, my last resort if I was the mage is to cast Protected Image, which gives me slight invincibility for a limited time, then go in and melee, but the mage doesn't have melee moves. However, mage you can whip out a dagger stab by pressing forward and attack together, and you can link that with your regular attack. One regular attack with staff linked to a dagger stab, and the dagger stab can sometimes issue a critical hit. Maybe 10% chance critical hit chance, so if I was stuck with the ghost boss and all my useful spells gone, I will cast Protected Image and try to land critical dagger hits, and at that point in the game I should have 2 Protected Image spells each lasting 10 seconds max, and if after that the ghost is still alive I can try to finish him off with Magic Missile. It's a shit spell and the ghost has skeleton minions that get in the way, and the magic missiles will hit those minions first, so one way to do it is when the ghost opens its jaws to try to eat me. It's actually at its most dangerous and weakest point. It takes extra damage with the jaws open, so when it does that I can use the fireball motion command slide to try and dodge it, and then double tap in a direction to rush at the skeletons to knock them down, and once skeletons are on the ground the magic missiles don't hit them and the magic missiles will go for the boss ghost. So that's one last resort way I can maybe take out the ghost boss if I was an idiot and used up my other spells low earlier, but it's tough to execute in the clutch. Imagine you're playing with money or want to finish 1 credit and you're stuck in that situation and need to do a fireball slide perfectly to avoid the ghost's jaws and the skeletons, then have to knock over the skeletons and also change your inventory wheel to magic missile and shoot them only when you've knocked the skeletons to the ground for a second. But yes, so much skill and depth and decision making involved. There's no other beat 'em up like this. And oh yeah, another option if you planned beforehand is you can chuck silver daggers at the ghosts, since ghosts are weak to silver I think, but that's not going to totally kill it. But yeah, so much thought was put into the gameplay design of these games, it's pretty amazing down to the finest detail. Another example is spells like Elemental and Firestorm takes up the whole screen, so unless your enemy can disappear when getting up you can keep casting those fast and it'll most likely hit. Some bosses though, like Dark Warrior, Naga, and maybe Dark Elf, can sometimes disappear and reappear. That's when you have to be careful, but lightning is totally different. Lightning isn't a full room effect, it's a beam that you can control and it knocks the enemies, so after I hit an enemy with it the enemy will fall to the ground and I can keep pressing lightning to attack that same enemy again, cause after the first hit the enemy will be in the in-air animation about to fall down. Enemy animations for when falling and getting up makes them invincible to the lightning strike, so that we can't cheap out the CPU with it, so when casting lightning I have to make sure the boss isn't in disappear mode. and I have to make sure if I hit the boss that I don't cast it again right away. I need to wait a second or two for the boss to fall and stumble and hit the ground. Then there's about a 1 second frame where the boss is lying on the ground flat when I can hit it again with lightning, but if I miss that window and the boss is in getting up animation, it won't work again. So using lightning is very different from elemental and ice storm, and it makes sense too because there's different level of spells. And lightning is a tier lower of spell compared to elemental and ice storm, so it's a bit easier to come by, and other classes can find lightning ring much easier, so they designed it this way so you can't just spam it. So much thought into the fine-tuning of each little element. Elemental warriors can find a magic bottle to use, but they don't allow you to stack it. You can only hold one at a time cause otherwise it's too overpowered, but lightning rings can stack. Wizards casting their own non-ring lightning is a bit stronger because wizards can control the angle of the beam to sweep across the screen at an angle, but other classes relying on the lightning ring to cast can only shoot the beam straight ahead, and I'm not talking about spell stacking yet. At set points of the game the wizard can replenish spells, but to a set amount, like say for conjure elemental maybe 3 and lightning 4, but since the game has random drops sometimes along your journey you might find say a lightning or elemental spell, and if I never used an elemental spell and I still have 3 of them and I pick up another one, that will give me 4, which is over the replenish amount. So now if I'm good enough and I know what I'm doing, I can opt not to use the elemental spell at all for most of the game, and I can keep stacking that spell instead. Since I'm already over the replenish limit, I can opt to keep collecting more elementals and stack it up to 9, and along the way I can try to make do using the other spells instead if I know what other spells work for that, and that way by the end of the game I have extra spells cause now I have 7 or 9 elementals saved up for use. But then this takes knowing the game and what bosses come when and which spells are good for what bosses. Like if it's the Ogre Brothers early on, if I wanted to stack lightning cause suddenly I got some extra lightning spells, then I can use reverse gravity on them with the right timing, and I can use protected image to try and critical hit stab them and use magic missile, but that will take more manu evering. Cause normally for ogres I would use protected image to stab, then use lightning, then if any health left for them I'll use either ice storm or elemental, but if I have any of these over the replenish limit I might want to save and stack these for late game, so we'll have to change up the strategy. That way I can have more spells for the red dragon and naga at the end, and I'm not even talking about the regular inventory tools like when to use hammer and throwing daggers and when to use healing rings. If I can find them, and blinding light. Like if I was the warrior and I found a lightning ring early on, I won't use it or waste it until closer to the end when I meet the ghost, cause fighting melee with ghost is a death sentence. Well, I can slash and combo and try to fireball slide to dodge its jaws, but it's not easy, so you would want to stack up and save your lightning rings for the ghost and naga when you're a warrior. But if someone who doesn't know the game or they're just going to spam continues, they won't learn this and they'll just unload the lightning ring on an early boss cause they found it. But someone who knows the game as a warrior will hold onto all lightning rings and save them until 40 minutes later closer to the end and never use it early. So when I face the flying harpies boss early in the game, instead I'll load up on hammers and daggers, and once the harpies flies in I first unload all my hammers on it, which will stun and make it dizzy for a bit, then I hurry and switch to daggers and unload my daggers on it. Then as I chuck the last dagger I will melee attack and combo into a fireball motion slash mixes with a dragon punch style aerial attack, and then if I'm good enough, if I got it in the air with the last dragon punch type hit, I'll try to juggle it with another well-timed aerial hit and then just dodge and fight melee, but I won't use the lightning ring. Plus the harpies are always flying up and down, so as I mentioned before, warrior using a lightning ring can only shoot straight ahead, so might not hit the harpies sometimes as it flies up, but if I'm super desperate and have an elemental bottle I might use that. Because elemental bottle for warrior doesn't stack, you can only hold one, and I don't need it for the next dark elf boss cause I'll be using burning oil for that boss. So for harpies, if I have a fire bottle and I'm desperate, might as well use it then, plus I need the extra inventory slot later anyways to reload on daggers and hammers and large burning oil, so no space to keep the fire bottle anyways. But yes, so much thought and design in these games, and you throw into it Street Fighter like moves with fireball motion slashes and down up motion dragon punch style attacks, unless you're the mage, which don't have these combos, and the dodging takes so much skill cause it's a fireball motion with jump to execute a sliding dodge, and how long you hold onto the jump button decides how far you slide, so it's not like modern games where it's just press one button and you can roll or dodge. You have to do a fireball motion move to execute the slide or dodge before you get hit. See, Japanese always know how to fine-tune their games and gameplay because that's how passionate and dedicated and detail-oriented they are. Unlike Western companies, all they want to do is milk gamers by half-assing a game, ship it with an empty shell and add truckloads of DLC and microtransactions later on. Not to mention a lot of Western games tend to be buggy and unfinished. I've rarely ran into a Japanese game that's been buggy and unfinished and milks the user. Square Enix has been milking Final Fantasy VII recently, but that's an exception since that's a cash cow for them, and at least the product is not diluted since the remakes were good. It's not like Bethesda, who keeps re-releasing Skyrim a million times to milk it as much as they can. Or even Rockstar, who released a buggy half-finished remaster of the 3D Grand Theft Auto games. The Blizzard devs for Diablo 3 didn't understand what made it so great and completely took out all the mood and ambience and fine balanced gameplay from Diablo 2 and just made a game for casuals. I'm not sure if Diablo 4 is better since I haven't played it, but Diablo 3 sucked, lacked all the charm and substance from Diablo 2, and even tried to milk gamers for real money using that auction house during the first few years. Made the loot drop super rare to force people to use the auction house to spend real money to buy decent gear. And then when they fixed it by removing the auction house, they made the loot drops too frequent, and then it became unbalanced in the other direction. Those devs didn't know what made Diablo 2 special and ruined it with the sequel. These days there's all these remakes and remasters and reboots, and a lot of them just tread on the legacy of the originals. Same with Hollywood. All remakes and remasters and reboots that destroy the original's legacy. Like the Star Wars movies. Disney ruined everything. Episode 7 was just a rehash of A New Hope cause J.J. Abrams decided to just copy Lucas except make the new characters as shallow as he can. Rey is basically a non-character throughout the whole trilogy. Then with Episode 8 and Rian Johnson is where shit really hits the fan. Luke fucking Skywalker and they turn him into a miserable old alien milk drinking hermit. He doesn't even go into battle physically and just dies alone after using his force powers. Never reunites with Han or Leia. But Rian kills off Luke and kills off Snoke and leaves basically nothing for Episode 9, where they had no ideas left and had to bring back Emperor Palpatine again as a desperate half-assed measure. Kylo Ren had potential, but once he took off his mask and became this emo soap opera kid, I was like fuck this and didn't care anymore. Yeah, the prequel trilogy sucked too, but at least there was the Darth Maul lightsaber battles which were something. The sequel trilogy doesn't even have that. But yeah, Disney ruined Star Wars. They handled Marvel relatively better, although there's nothing special about any of the MCU movies. Most of them are pretty decent, pretty good, and none of them great. Granted, none of them sucked as bad as some of the DC movies or Fox Marvel movies, but at least the DC movies and Fox Marvel movies had some genuinely great movies too. DC had the Dark Knight trilogy and Joker, which were genuinely great movies. Fox had the X-Men prequels and Logan, which were pretty good. MCU didn't have any movies that were as good as those cause they play it too safe and add too much comedy, hence will never be taken as seriously as those movies. And this is why Western companies will continue to milk consumers dry. Not like Japanese people who have integrity and the CEOs all taking pay cuts during COVID, not using COVID as an excuse to raise prices and make more money. Pretty much any products from any country I find on average just isn't as reliable as Japanese stuff. But then it's nuts how OCD Japanese people are. BMW got freaked out by Toyota's quality control test standards cause BMW and Toyota cooperated on an engine together, but at first Toyota bosses were hesitant cause they didn't want any of the European unreliability affecting their reliability standards. So Toyota put every little thing of the engine through strict quality control tests back in Japan, everything from a type of nut or bolt or screw used. They tested the shit out of everything down to that level back in Japan, had it all shipped back, and supposedly BMW techs were shocked how stringent Toyota was in their QA tests, and guess what? That co-developed BMW engine turned out to be the most reliable engine BMW ever made. My buddy's dad's BMW, which uses this co-developed engine, it's been 6 years now and he hasn't had a single issue. That's unheard of for BMW. But then the later stuff that they developed by themselves had problems again, like the new BMW i4 has coolant leaks everywhere even when brand new. German reliability sucks. Like with BMW, when something breaks it's already at least twice the price to fix versus a Japanese car maybe more than twice, and Porsche even more. Was looking into a Porsche Panamera hybrid, but everyone on the board said that the hybrid will file soon, just a matter of when, and in 3 to 6 years the hybrid battery will cost at least $20,000 to replace for Porsche. There's a lot of BMW fanboys online who will always tell people that you just have to make sure you take care and service it correctly and it will last. German stuff always lasts if you follow the instructions. That's total bullshit. These people don't know anything about cars because BMW uses plastic parts needlessly, whereas in Japanese cars the same part is made with metal. Of course that plastic part will naturally crack cause the engine will be hot, so it will get hot and expand and contract each day, so that plastic part will crack eventually. It's not abuse, it's planned failure, and a German car normally uses way more plastic needlessly everywhere in the engine area. That same hose or pipe is plastic for European cars and it's some metallic alloy for Japanese. My BMW expansion tank is 2 pieces of thin plastic glued together. It's an expansion tank, so it will get super hot and of course the glue will fail after 4 years. The Japanese cars, the expansion tanks they use way thicker robust plastic and the 2 pieces are welded together, making it one true piece with no glue used. So it's 1 piece thick plastic that's not brittle and never fails. The BMW expansion tank is the super thin brittle plastic, and those are facts. It has nothing to do with abusing or taking care or servicing it. So BMW fanboys who say that bullshit just don't know anything about cars. My mechanic friends all show me the difference. They go through the engines with me, European vs Japanese. The Japanese stuff, everything is put in places where they are easily fixable. First off, they won't break in the first place, but if it does at least you can get to it easily. German cars, everything is designed to fail and it's hard to get to it, so you have to remove other parts just to get to it, which costs more. Just like my Mont Blanc pen. I never use it, but the ink cartridge inside, which is proprietary and expensive, is designed to dry out either way on its own in 2 months or so. My Parker pen on the other hand has been 10 years or more and still not dry. And my Sennheiser HD800 headphones, the headband and earpads all need replacing after 5 years or so. The fabric starts leaking color and flakes. It's only for the HD800, their most expensive model, because they know customers who buy the HD800 must have money, so they have a shitload of replacement earpads and headbands ready for sale. Hundreds of bucks each. So many European brands are full of shit. All those luxury brands. But especially the German and Italian stuff. German people are very slimy and calculating, and they're good at engineering and math. So good in fact that they can calculate exactly when their engineering will fail and base their warranty on that. They plan their engineering failures really well. My BMW's radiator and expansion tank literally fails every 4 years consistently, and the warranty is 4 years, which means they designed it to fail right after the warranty. I've changed mine 3 times already every 4 years. My BMW's windshield in the front, you know, our rear view mirror for cars, normally the rear view mirror is attached to the top of the inside of the car, then it sticks out towards the windshield. It's not actually attached to the windshield. First off, this makes it much more durable, and second, you can replace the rear view mirror and windshield independently. Well, my BMW, the rear view mirror is glued onto the windshield, so if either one breaks you got to replace the entire windshield. So if my windshield cracks, I need to get a special BMW windshield that has the BMW rear view mirror and sensor already attached, or if my rear view mirror broke I need to replace the whole windshield. It's a terrible design. On my parents' Honda Accord the rear view mirror is attached to the frame of the car. But at least with Germans, you know, they are good with engineering cause they planned that failure precisely. With Italians it's just pathetic and lazy. They market their stuff as luxury even though Italy hasn't been prosperous economically since the Roman Empire, which was like over 1,000 years ago. Modern Italy isn't on the same level economically as France, UK, or Germany. Yet they market their stuff as luxury. But you can tell they cut corners and they are lazy as hell. Just look at the quality control for their cars like Lamborghini, Ferrari, Fiat, Alfa Romeo, Maserati. All these brands, they hype it up as on the same level as any other European luxury brand, but they will fail even faster than the German stuff and are even more unreliable. And German stuff is already more unreliable than American stuff, which is saying a lot. But yeah, goes to show nobody can compare to Japan when it comes to quality control and consistency. I see, so looks like you've been playing games a lot these days? Not really. When I have free time I usually watch movies or read some books. Usually some great Ursula Le Guin books, or look up some great international films or 1980s Hong Kong horror or action movies. The thing about a lot of mainstream movie watchers is that they don't watch enough movies. They only know the modern Hollywood stuff, which are all garbage, focusing too much on the action and special effects and milking a franchise with endless sequels, reboots, and remakes. They haven't watched much indie films or international films, which is where most of the truly great films are. That's why there's so many casual cinema fans that think Tarantino is a great director when in fact he sucks. Tarantino is even worse than Kobe, because at least Kobe, although super overrated, was a legit professional basketball player. Tarantino is legitimately not a good director at all. He doesn't have the fundamental tools to make a good movie without plagiarizing. But because he's so mainstream, he can fool the high school and college kids or people who still have the mind and lack of experience of one, cause these people have never watched a classic foreign film in their lives. They watch Hollywood blockbusters, and cause of the hype train of Tarantino they jump on that bandwagon and think they graduated to film buff. But they never watched a classic foreign film, so they have no idea the real world of cinema and how much Tarantino just plagiarized, like Pulp Fiction. I actually find his stuff unwatchable cause it's barely a movie. From my standpoint, I've watched at least as many films as Tarantino himself, so I know exactly what he's ripping off each scene. And funny thing is, although he has no real film skill, but because Tarantino is a film buff that has watched a lot of movies, he plagiarizes other films he's watched frame by frame, multiple cool scenes from the most obscure films, and then he turns around and doesn't talk about those films but rather lies about it and gives credit to another film instead as his influence. So he plagiarizes a movie which he knows is more obscure so less people know it, but then gives credit to another movie which is less similar. Like he'll mention a Kubrick film or Kurosawa film even though he actually plagiarized Jean-Luc Godard or Wong Kar-wai, and most people won't notice and will think his movies are just homages when they are actually plagiarized frame by frame. It's like a university project that's plagiarized from multiple sources. A paragraph from this article and a paragraph from that article, and then in the bibliography and source list all the other books that he didn't plagiarize from. But you can tell he has no real skill himself, and what he does is he just makes movies revolving around scenes that he watches from obscure films that he can copy frame by frame. Then he takes music from obscure sources and movies and splices them, then writes down regular everyday dialogue that he might have talked with friends like about potato chips for example, and just pointlessly throw it into a stationary scene. Like when characters sit in a cafe or a car, which is easy to do. I can just write some random dialogue you and me can have about some spicy potato chips that I had the other day and make that the dialogue of the characters for no reason when they're just sitting down to waste 5 minutes, and hence that's how you get that McRoyale with cheese scene in Pulp Fiction that everyone thinks is so deep when it's just a lazy scene to make. However, where you can tell he has no real movie making skill is his movies don't have real characters. There's no character development, no dilemma, no emotion, and he doesn't know how to write characters, and he doesn't know how to write true original dialogue that furthers the story or characters. So for the dialogues in his films that he has to have, cause you need it to further the story, and those dialogues are so bad it's like Star Wars prequel bad. Only unlike George Lucas, he hides his lack of writing skill behind a shitload of profanity and swear words, and he doesn't know how to tell a proper story. He doesn't know how to build precedents and then further the story and to give it meaning, so his movies feel like a bunch of scenes he ripped off that's pieced together in a disjointed manner, cause he has nothing good to add himself to the movie, so he just covers it all with a lot of swear words and pointless violence. All his iconic scenes were ripped off frame by frame from other classic movies, and then he puts in some catch hipster wannabe music to fool the low IQ kids, and that's it. So his films are literally unwatchable for me, they're just a plagiarized joke. Like in Reservoir Dogs when he ripped off the Hong Kong movie City on Fire frame by frame, or in Pulp Fiction in one of his iconic scenes was ripped off a super obscure early Scorsese documentary, and the famous Travolta and Uma Thurman dance scene is of course from a lesser known Goddard film, and it's not loosely inspired from either, it's ripped off frame by frame. Watch Lady Snowblood and a few Kazaka film and you'll see where he ripped off for Kill Bill. And the script he wrote for this romance movie was also ripped off a Goddard film called Vivre Sav. A regular person who falls in love with a prostitute and then has to deal with her pimp. But the problem is his movies are normally way worse than the originals he ripped off. Like he rips off Wong Kar-wai, but he doesn't have the meaning and emotions of a Wong Kar-wai film. He's a huge fan of Wong Kar-wai, sure, but he just rips off the scene frame by frame but doesn't get the meaning behind it, so his movies are like empty shells. It can confuse the American high school and college kid hipsters with low IQ and low experience cause they haven't seen anything, so they don't know what they're watching, and I don't care if Tarantino has some foot fetish as long as he makes a decent movie, which he hasn't. Alfred Hitchcock had fetishes too, but at least he made good movies. And the thing is, all these top 10 lists ranking films, they are all going to be popular, well-known films and American-centric. There's so many good movies that are not mentioned in these lists that are more obscure. There's 5 or 6 Hirokazu Kurita films that are amongst the greatest all-time, or Jan Troll films, and Ingmar Bergman has way more than just Persona. Movies by Yuri Bykov or Mia Hansen-Løve or Ken Loach. Sure, anyone who's a film buff would have seen at least one Andrei Tarkovsky film, but the thing is there's all these obscure films that are every bit as good, and there's a lot of directors who might have made just 1 or 2 really great obscure or indie films and then disappeared cause they had one good story to tell and that was it. There was this Bhutan film I watched recently called A Yak in the Classroom that was really good too, for example. Every year I go to the film festival and I'm watching these independent films from all around the world where I have no idea who the director is but I think are really original and great, but then that's the only movie they will ever release. Like Crush the Skull, which is an Asian American indie film that was pretty good, takes the usual Western stereotypes and breaks it all down, and the main character is Asian and his girlfriend is a hot white chick, and the Asian is the leader of this group and the hot white chick's brother is the dumbass of the group, and then they have this other Asian dumbass that acts like a black guy thug wannabe, and they're a bunch of professional thieves and they were trying to do this heist, but ends up the house they're trying to rob is a trap house by a crazy serial killer and they get stuck in this house and try to get out. But yeah, for Soviet filmmakers Sergei Dvortsevoy and Yuri Bykov are my 2 favorite. Amongst well-known films, of course, 2001 A Space Odyssey and The Godfather have to be there, and In the Mood for Love is great as well, but so is Days of Being Wild and Happy Together too. A Moment of Romance is another great underappreciated Hong Kong film. People always feel like they have to put a Federico Fellini film in these lists, so whatever. I'm okay with that. Citizen Kane is always in there because it's an older film, but I disagree with it because I don't think it's anything special by today's standards, and even for its day, Gone with the Wind or Wizard of Oz might have been more technically impressive. Tokyo Story is a good movie, but there's a lot of other Yasujiro Ozu films that I would take over Tokyo Story too. Harakiri is a good film that I think deserves to be on the list. And for Hitchcock, although he has many great films, I don't think I would put any in a top 10 list. Although Vertigo is a good film, I prefer other Hitchcock films like Psycho, Birds, Rope, Rear Window and Rebecca. People usually don't watch films deeply enough to really understand if it's good or bad. Everyone puts Parasite on the list of greatest Korean films when really there was nothing special about the film, and the social class struggling metaphor was so obvious and the twist so expected, whereas my favorite Korean film might be Burning, although lesser known, has much more depth than Parasite. Burning, the story is not about whether or not the guy killed the girl or not, but rather it's an observation on the process of prejudice and passing judgment, so it's more about the process of the main character passing judgment on the rich guy thinking that he killed her. That's more what it's talking about, but I would say Burning is an exception because most Korean films don't really have much depth, and it's an exception because it's based on a Haruki Murakami story, that's why. And that's why for Dawn of the Dead it's the reason why it's such a great horror film, because although it has social commentary as an element, it never lets it affect the horror or undermine it. There's countless movies where they try to add some spoil commentary and it's out of place, or it even sacrifices the film's original intent just to make a point and it becomes a parody. Like for example District 9, where they completely sacrificed the sci-fi aspect and every other aspect of the movie just to get across the thinly veiled reference to the South African apartheid. They just shove the metaphor down your throat and sacrifice the rest of the story for it, and it's not even a good sci-fi film anymore. Same with Fight Club. Another overrated movie because everything in it is sacrificed: the characters, the story, everything is sacrificed in order to shove the main social commentary in your face about how consumerism makes people's lives empty and how they have to set up fights with random strangers in order to feel something and randomly destroy property for no reason. A great movie like Fright Night doesn't do that because yes, it's got tribute and homage to vintage horror and even pokes fun at itself and the horror industry, but when the horror happens it's real, so it never goes too far to the point where it affects the horror, so it never becomes a parody of itself. Another overrated film is Apocalypse Now because it was based off of an overrated book called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Francis Ford Coppola wasn't even sure what he was making, and then when he finally pieced together to try to say it talks about the dehumanizational nature of war, which was the essence of the metaphor for Heart of Darkness as well, and because of the troubled development it ended up being a bunch of disjointed scenes pieced together to show his metaphor of the gradual dehumanization of war, which is what makes it so pretentious when the whole movie is just trying to act deep by revolving around this one simple metaphor. Coppola, don't get me wrong, is a talented director, and proof of that is that he managed to still salvage a movie out of it by piecing all these disjointed scenes together, but then as a result the movie is kind of weird when you watch it. And later generations, because of the confusing nature of the film, just started tacking on fake meaning and shit that wasn't there just because it's disjointed. It fools dummies to think that there's something there when there wasn't, similar to how people think Pulp Fiction was a deep movie because of how disjointed it is when in reality it was just a mess and there's nothing else there. But yeah, with Dawn of the Dead what makes it so great is that in addition to the social commentary it has good characters and good relationships with the characters, but none of these sacrifice anything with the horror intent. If anything, it adds to it and they work together like a seamless concoction into this one organic thing that just works, and the fact that the characters are so well developed and have good relationships just adds to the horror, cause now you don't want anything to happen to them and you literally feel the pain when one of them dies, unlike a typical horror slasher flick where you don't even care about the characters because it's just whoever dies next from the killer. When George Romero made Dawn of the Dead, sure, he makes a social commentary about the consumerist attitude of the USA, and then he makes a commentary with the biker gang about how men are sometimes more dangerous. However, he never lets that dominate the horror, and at the end everyone, even the biker gang, gets chewed up by the zombies, and then you see two zombies after that night fighting over scraps. It's a symbol of how sometimes people are fucking each other over, but then even that doesn't dominate the film because you realize the four main characters really take care of each other, and that's something too, so it's not like simple analogy or metaphor and that's it. Yeah. And that's the thing. What made it great wasn't cause it has these metaphors. What made it great was, in spite of the fact of it having social commentary and metaphors, that none of the characters and story and horror element of the film was ever sacrificed. Instead, it all blended together perfectly and elevated each other, like when he made that commentary of consumerism. He's not like, oh, he's trying to say something here, so the movie is great. That's what Tarantino fan level IQ would think. The fact there's a metaphor about consumerism doesn't make a film a great film. What makes it great is the social commentary never affects the other aspects or gets in the way. Instead, it's presented in an organic, natural way, just one piece of the whole thing, and it adds to the horror too, like that scene in the mall after they take over and they're just enjoying themselves in the mall now cause they have so much stuff, and then you see how decadent they are, and in the PA Mall announcement an automatic announcement comes on where a woman's recording is telling all shoppers that in the next hour if your purchases amount to a certain amount you can have a bag of hard candy for free. And this scene shows how empty our modern consumerist society is. However, it's not the fact that this commentary is there that makes it great. The zombie horror is still all there and real. However, it's the fact that once you realize how these scenes showing the emptiness of our consumerist culture is very similar to how empty now the characters are in their end of the world situation, it's that realization of the emptiness of things that adds to the horror brought about by the realization of the futility and emptiness of life. And this is just one very small aspect of the film, cause at the end of the day you think, wow, all this emptiness and shit, but then wait, the characters in the end, they really still do care about each other and they are genuinely good people, so not all is lost on humanity. And then also you realize even though they have hope they fly off in a helicopter, but the zombies still take over everything, so there's still futility even if we seem to have hope, and the horror aspect is never sacrificed. It's not just gore horror, which it does have, but it's never gratuitous or in your face. It's intellectual horror, intellectual fear. So yeah, it's not like Apocalypse Now where it's just a metaphor of the dehumanization of war, or District 9 where it's just a simple metaphor about the South African apartheid, or Fight Club where it's a simple point about empty consumerism and all the characters and story everything is non-existent and sacrificed just to show those simple metaphors, compared to an accomplishment like Dawn of the Dead. Of course, Dawn of the Dead is so great that a lot of people can love it just for the intellectual fear, and some can love it for the gore, and some can love it for the story, and some can love it for the social commentary, but only very few select people can understand it's great because it's none of these and yet all of these. So now you understand why I don't find films like Pulp Fiction all that great when all these morons are praising it thinking they know great films when they actually don't know anything. And the thing is, modern audiences don't understand that for stuff like action films, Hollywood was way behind Hong Kong. They think Terminator 2 and Die Hard and Matrix and Kill Bill are all-time great action films. But when you go back to the 80s with Hong Kong actors that did all their own stunts back then, it was far ahead of what Hollywood had back then. One of the Hong Kong chicks back then, Moon Lee, actually suffered third-degree burns to her back and parts of her face in this one stunt. It was an explosion and she was supposed to jump out of a building or something that was about to explode, but the guy operating the explosives detonated it too early and she got burned. She still has scars now and she didn't sue or anything. Just kept filming and called it a day. That was the definition of Hong Kong filmmaking back then. Life was cheap, everyone did their own stunts, everyone had to learn how to fight and do flips and shit, and these chicks literally need to know how to fight and do their own stunts, not like Uma Thurman in Kill Bill just holding a sword and waving it around. These Hong Kong stars literally had to learn how to fight and they're doing real flips and kicks and shit, whereas Hollywood used stuntmen for everything. For action films, Hong Kong was so far ahead of its time it's not even funny. Totally different universe and it's objective. I mean, Bruce Lee is from the early 1970s and compared to the stuff from Hollywood back then there was hardly even an action genre in Hollywood at the time. And by the time you got the 1980s with Jackie Chan, Yuen Biao, Donnie Yen, Sammo Hung, Andy Lau, Leslie Chung, Chow Yun-fat and all the John Woo action films like A Better Tomorrow, The Killer, Hard Boiled etc. was just so far ahead of Hollywood, and that's why I was never high on Hollywood action films growing up, cause I grew up watching films from all countries and seeing Hong Kong action films during the same time. It's just not even close. So no way can I possible like movies like Terminator 2 or Die Hard, and even back then watching Terminator 2 as a kid I felt the movie sucked. It's just Arnold holding a gun and slowing, pointing and shooting, and that's it. No choreography or nothing and some CGI special effects and that's it, no emotional content. I mean, Hollywood by the late 90s already brought in John Woo, Yuen Wo-ping and all the Hong Kong choreographers, action directors and stuntmen and learned from them. Like if you look at Matrix and even Kill Bill, Hong Kong's legendary Yuen Wo-ping was the action director for Matrix and Kill Bill, and their action scenes were literally choreographed by Hong Kong's Yuen Wo-ping, and most modern Hollywood stuntmen and action choreographers who aren't Hong Kong, all grew up idolizing Hong Kong action films as well. In case people didn't know, John Wick's action director used to work under Yuen Wo-ping and learned from Hong Kong action projects as well. Hong Kong films like The Killer, A Better Tomorrow, Hard Boiled, God of Gamblers, Iron Angels all have way more action than any of those famous Hollywood action films at the time. And remember last time I was talking about how Cantonese is more like the ancient language in China, and also how a lot of traditional ancient Chinese traditions and cultures only survived in Guangzhou and then ultimately Hong Kong? A lot of traditional ancient Chinese cultures like its martial arts practices eventually all went southwards to Guangzhou, and that's why Guangzhou/Canton had such a strong martial arts fighting background, probably from feeling from Mongols and Manchus, and ultimately with communism all these ancient traditions of China went to Hong Kong. The last free city of Guangzhou, that's why Ip Man, Bruce Lee's teacher and a lot of others who were originally from Guangzhou all fled to Hong Kong, so Wing Chun, Hung Gar, Tai Chi and a lot of stuff all survived in Guangzhou. Because if we delve back to ancestry, a lot of the famous legends like Hong Chi Guan, they went southwards and their martial arts descendants rooted themselves in Guangzhou. Hong Chi Guan was former Shaolin and eventually those descendants went to Hong Kong to flee communism, I mean Hong Ziguan, hence why so many traditional ancient Chinese traditions and languages and stuff only survived in Guangzhou and Hong Kong. That's why I see a lot of martial arts stuff and spiritual stuff and other things that I only see in Hong Kong and Guangzhou, but I don't see anywhere else in China. Most of it's lost cause everyone fled southwards multiple times to Guangzhou in history to flee Mongols and Manchus, I'm guessing just like the last Song emperor who fled to Guangzhou to avoid Mongols and died Guangzhou. My family ancestors too were northern originally but moved down to Guangzhou 900 years ago, which is around the end of Song dynasty, but yes, so many cool ancient traditional stuff I see only in Guangzhou and Hong Kong now, like Chinese medicine. Most of the original full text of Chinese medicine books were destroyed in mainland China cause of communism etc. The full texts only survive in Hong Kong and Japan cause Japan used to use Chinese medicine in ancient times, so nowadays a lot of Chinese medicine doctors in mainland had to get the full texts back from Hong Kong and Japan. Maybe Taiwan too, but then with Taiwan cause the exodus from the soldiers were so abrupt they probably failed to bring with them a lot of stuff, but with Hong Kong and Japan they were already deeply rooted there. So Hong Ziguan fled southwards to avoid the Manchus, so yeah, hence why such a strong martial arts background in Guangzhou and Hong Kong. It's really interesting. Hong Ziguan is a legend to Cantonese people. Multiple different styles of martial arts branched from his descendants in Guangzhou and Hong Kong, like Hung Gar. Wang Fei Hung might have been one of his martial arts descendants. And when it comes to wuxia, you have great Chinese novelists like Jin Yang. Jin Yang's novels alone single-handedly helped keep Chinese culture evolving in the last 70 years, and Jin Yang alone literally accounts for so much of our Chinese culture now. And the reason why we might not be seeing a lot of Jin Yang adaptations in the media like video games yet is because Three Kingdoms and Journey to the West and Outlaws of the Marsh were translated into Japanese in ancient times already back during the Ming Dynasty, so Japanese people know these stories very well since ancient times, hence why there were more video games on them, since Japanese would be the ones making video games related to these things. Like there's been Jin-Yong translations into Japanese but only in the past 30 years, so it's not nearly as steeped into Japanese culture as those three ancient novels, but in terms of modern popularity I'd say among Chinese people Jin-Yong novels are a lot more famous. If you talk with anyone from Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Singapore, or Chinese Canadians they would know more about Jin-Yong stuff normally, but the West is more familiar with Three Kingdoms because of the Dynasty Warriors video games and Journey to the West because of Dragon Ball the anime and manga which was based on it. All Americans can do to advertise Jin-Yong's Legend of the Condor Heroes lately is to say he's the Chinese Tolkien, but he's in most ways much better than Tolkien. And Tolkien is great. I'm a huge fan of Lord of the Rings and I've read Lord of the Rings at least twice, but Jin-Yong is another level. All they do is say Jin-Yong is the Chinese Tolkien or the Chinese Lord of the Rings, but Jin-Yong's novels are way deeper, and Jin-Yong's novels along with being super creative have way more character development, way more character depth, and it has way more complex and interesting side characters with complex relationships with each other, also way more details in creativity like the types of martial arts and the fantastical creativity he puts into the philosophy of each martial arts. Cause the English language has never seen an author the caliber of Jin-Yong. Western literature has never seen such a talent, cause his novels have depth too, along with being super creative, like the dilemma of Yang Hang, one of the main characters in Legend of the Condor Heroes. He's Han but cause of circumstances was born and raised as a Jurchen prince. During the height of the Jurchen Empire when Han people were weak, so he had a big identity crisis which led to a whole shitload of stuff later on, and even his son suffering from his mistakes later on in the sequel, and then his son had to redeem himself, and Yang Hang wasn't even the main character in Legend. The main character was Guokjing, who was a sworn brother cause their fathers were sworn brothers, but Guok also cause of circumstances, was Han, but was born and grew up in Mongolia in Genghis Khan's camp. So the novel analyzed both characters, both Han Chinese but both grew up in a foreign environment, and their decisions and how they view their own identity, and of course, these decisions had a big impact on the main character of the sequel in Return of the Condor Heroes, who was Yang Hang's son. So his stories is like Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Three Kingdoms, where it's got scope and it spans generations, and it also has very detailed character development and character analysis like a Charles Dickens or Ursula L. Le Guin book, and it has a lot of different characters and complex relationships like Game of Thrones or Dickens. And it's got all the hightail fantasy and war and epicness of Tolkien. He wrote so many different novel series and they were all good and different from each other, and each main character is different from each other too, and then on top of this, he ends his career with Deer and the Cauldron, Duke of Mount Deer, which is vastly different from his previous stuff but was also one of his greatest novels. That novel is different cause it's more of a comedy adventure with the main character as more of an anti-hero who doesn't like to fight or learn martial arts, and more talks about his adventures and his friendship with the Manchu King Kangxi. Vastly different from what he normally writes, but still so good. It's like Beatles ending their career with Abbey Road. Funny thing is, some of Bruce Lee's philosophies actually came from Jin-Yong novels. Like Bruce Lee never admitted, but I know he loves to read, and he loves to read Jin-Yong. Before his death he was actually planning to make a wuxia film, and yeah, a lot of his ideas and philosophies were probably influenced by Jin-Yong novels cause Jin-Yong novels had a lot of philosophies in there about martial arts etc. I'll give you an example of just one small minuscule aspect of his stories. In Return of the Condor Hero, the character secretly stumbled upon a tomb, and this was a tomb of an ancient martial arts master that no one remembers anymore, but in his time he just wished to be defeated even once, and the story talks about his stages. The tomb writes his levels and accomplishments in his life. This ancient master in his early years used a regular soft sword that was flexible, however cause of its unpredictability he injured someone by accident and he stopped using it. Then he moved on to the heavy sword that was made by this rare metal. No one really knows what it is, but it was some super heavy metal that even a seasoned martial arts with strong nei gong, inner chi strength, isn't able to wield it cause it's too heavy, but the sword is unbreakable cause its metal was so strong. That was his second stage, where his nei gong got so strong he can wield this unblockable weapon. This third stage according to the tomb was the wooden sword, so it was just a wood sword cause he got to a level where he doesn't need to rely on the strength of the sword anymore. His nei gong internal chi got so strong and so refined was his inner chi strength that he can destroy anything with a wooden sword. So he can cut through a thick tree with the wooden sword and the wooden sword won't break. And then, his last stage. In the tomb, in his last stage, all you see is nothing, no weapon and just some dried up grass and leaves, and it showed in his final stage. His martial arts level and his inner chi strength got so strong that he no longer needs a weapon, and any blade of grass or anything can be used as a weapon. So the main character saw this tomb and was fascinated, and the main character for Return of the Condor Heroes was very smart and inquisitive and competitive, so he was the perfect personality to reverse engineer and learn out of all these stages. He chose to take the heavy sword with him, but he had no idea how to use it cause it was so heavy, and he was already a seasoned martial artist, but he realized that this legend used to eat snake gallbladder to cultivate his internal chi, and he realized by there's a waterfall/cave by this tomb, and he reversed engineered how he thought this ancient legend developed his martial arts, so he's that smart that he can reverse engineer all this himself, so figured the ancient must have also trained under the waterfall each day to cultivate his chi strength going against the force of the waterfall. And there were random boulders falling down from the waterfall each day, so he would train under the force of the waterfall and the unpredictability of the falling boulders each day until he was strong enough to wield this weapon, and then years down the line he went back to the tomb to try to master the next level, the wooden sword, and the wooden sword required him to practice in the ocean against the waves, and he had to be able to cut through a thick tree with the wooden sword not breaking in order to achieve that stage. He never completed the stage. He went halfway and then he created his own martial arts, and he didn't require a weapon anymore for reasons I don't want to explain. His new martial arts he developed himself that's weaponless was based around his sadness and melancholy, where he can channel his chi strength when he's in a sad state. But yet, this is just like 1% of the stories in Jin Yong novels, just to let you know the amount of creativity and depth in his novels. All that stuff I talked about is maybe just one chapter, and we're not even talking about all the many different legendary fighters with different schools of martial arts and different martial arts philosophies and different lineages like Guokjeng, the main character of Legend of the Condor Heroes. His main martial arts is the 18 dragon subduing palms, where each strike is based on a theory of subduing the dragon, but these palm strikes are a yang style martial arts cause there's yin and yang. Yang being more strength and masculine. So these palm strkes. The form isn't very intricate. The key to the effectiveness of these strikes is in internal chi cultivation, to have very strong internal chi strength so you can fully use the strength of the strikes. However, his sworn brother Zhou Botong, who's a crazy martial arts genius who's like a generation older than him, this sworn brother, not the Jurchen prince, created this strange illogical martial arts cause he's crazy himself. He created a whacked out palm strike called left-right palm strikes, where his right and left hands act like they have a brain of their own, where it seems like they function independent from each other with different minds. In the book it's like the theory where it's hard to draw a circle and a square with each hand at the same time. The book talks about it like it's hard to hold two pens and draw a circle with one hand and a square with the other at the same time. So in the story it's saying he was able to cause he's kind of whacked out and he's not every logical. So in the story it says the more smarter a person is, the more logical they are, hence they have problems learning this whacked out left-right palm strike cause it doesn't make sense. However, Guokjing himself isn't very bright, so Guokjing was actually able to learn it, and together he was actually able to incorporate it with his 18 subduing dragon palms, which made him even more potent as a fighter. But yeah, so many creative ideas and details in his novels, and the thing about Bruce Lee's philosophy about being formless and being like water, that's from all these novels. The main character in Smiling Proud Wanderer, which is the Ming Dynasty now, he eventually learned a sword stance from an ancient legend, and that sword stance was called Dugu Nine Swords, which was an unknown lost martial arts, and Dugu Nine Swords principles were opposite of everything. It talks about being formless, and it talks about reacting to what they do and always having a counter for everything, so it's not so much a sword technique with rigid stances but rather a fluid be like waterifying technique filled with all the counters possible for every situation, and you just go with the flow. And this novel talks about being formless. Whereas this main character's own teacher is the opposite. His own teacher believes in tradition, believes in cultivating internal chi above all else and focusing on fundamentals, so he went opposite of his master after he learned the secret stance, and ends up the original creator of the stance was the same ancient legend from that tomb, the tomb with the heavy sword. So this stance was also his creation, and then in the novel it gets all philosophical and comparing. Cause yeah, you have this formless be like water stance. But then there's other supreme legends in the story too, whose martial arts are based on different principles, like Ren Woxing. His martial arts is about cultivating as much internal chi strength as possible, cause his martial arts can suck the life force from someone and then another villain. Invincible Asia. His martial arts is also formed from internal chi cultivation. However, his chi cultivation isn't yang. It's yang style chi, so Invincible Asia had to castrate himself first before he can learn that martial arts, cause it's a yang style martial arts with yang chi cultivation, but he got super strong too, where he can just flick a needle or anything and it kills someone, and then in the book you see how these different philosophies and styles clash. But yet, and I'm not even talking about the love, loyalty, relationships, and historical backdrops of his stories, cause there's plenty of that too, so yeah, the amount of depth and stuff in his novels are insane. But yet, these novels were written in Hong Kong too. Hong Kong really has been amazing. Its importance to Chinese culture can't be overstated. I mean Jin Yong, Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, all these Hong Kong movies, all this music. Like beyond. All the martial arts lineages in Hong Kong, and even Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was Cantonese, he started his rebellion using Hong Kong as home base. I think one of these days we should try to watch one of these classic Hong Kong TV dramas of a Jin Yong story. I have them all on DVD with English subtitles. They're some of the greatest things put on film. You have the great story and characters of Jin Yong, and 80s Hong Kong movie talent like Tony Leung, Chow Yun-fat, Andy Lau were all still making TV dramas at the time, and they were the star of these dramas. Imagine, an epic historical period fantasy drama written by Jin Yong and starring actors with the caliber of Tony Leung and Andy Lau. But yet, like that Return of the Condor Heroes story, which is the sequel. I told you a little bit about its martial arts fantasy and philosophy stuff. And also how the main character had to pay for his father's sins. and how it talks about the historical backdrop of the Mongol invasion. But on top of this, it's also a Romeo and Juliet type love story about forbidden love as well. So yeah. So many layers. Lord of the Rings doesn't hold a candle to this level detail and layers. With Western fantasy books it's normally something more simple. Like, oh, they need to find this all-powerful ring, or this person has a fire sword. It doesn't have the level of creativity and philosophy of a Jin Yong novel. But you see, that's why Hong Kong culture, music and movies peaked in the 1980s before the 1990s, where there was an exodus of Hong Kong talent and China took back Hong Kong from the British. I didn't even mention all the wacky crazy Sammo Hung films from that era, like Encounters of a Spooky Kind, Wheels on Meals, Winners and Sinners, Mr. Vampire, My Lucky Stars. Or My Flying Wife. It's like a comedy, gangster triad, ghost, action, romance movie. This story is about Sammo is a triad boss that has a lot of honor and loyalty, but his gang for some reason gets infested by a haunting, and the story unfolds from there. Or Where's Officer Tuba? Where the ghost of Sammo's dead police co-worker haunts him because he didn't keep his promise to avenge his death. Or Chinese Ghost Story, or Haunted Cop Shop, or the early Stephen Chow stuff. It's this kind of unique humor, charm and creativity that was so prevalent in Hong Kong in the 80s. Same with Japan. Their culture, music, animation kind of peaked in the 1980s as well, although they were very experimental since the 1950s with all that stuff. I mean, they had Godzilla in the 1950s along with all those famous Japanese directors already, Akira Kurosawa and Kenji Mizoguchi and Yasujiro Ozu, and then in the 1960s with Ultraman and Astro Boy, and then the 1970s with Lupin III, all much more creative and interesting than what America had at the time. I mean, with Lupin III, right out from episode 1, the chick character gets caught by the Yakuza, tied up and felt up everywhere, and Lupin touches her nipples later on. These are cartoons in the 60s and 70s that ran daily on TV that Japanese kids saw. 70s was the Japanese sexploitation era, where a lot of cult films had a lot of sex in it, like the Lady Scorpion prison movies with that hot chick and she gets naked and raped, but the movies actually have an artistic flair to it and are very quirky and abstract at times. Hong Kong too was very open sexually in the 70s and 80s too. So many Hong Kong movies had so much nudity and sex, like the 1976 movie Confessions of a Concubine. And some non-sex films too, like some horror films like Curse of the Golden Vampire that had so much nudity in it, and it's the 1970s. I was just watching this 1971 Hong Kong horror film The Bride from Hell. It's a serious ghost movie with a traditional vibe to it, but there's a lot of nudity in it. And into the 90s with crazy film series like Sex and Zen and Raped by an Angel and Erotic Ghost Story. Hong Kong was just as open sexually as Japan back then. But yet for Japanese anime in the 1980s it was so experimental, and I loved it for that stuff like Maison Ikkoku and Legend of the Galactic Heroes and Jirinko and Journey to the Milky Way Galaxy and the Great Adventures of Horus the Prince of the Sun and Ghosh the Cellist. And then for more recent anime films, I like 5 centimeters per second by Makoto Shinkai, probably the best out of all his films. It's got a lot of symbolism in it. It's about how our life is built up with moments that can both be the makeup of our life but also be the memories that haunt us, along with missed opportunities. It's a lot like a Wong Kar-wai film. In the third act, 2 girls show up. One is the original girl from Act 1 and the other is the guy's current girlfriend, who he ends up breaking up with because he's still haunted by the first relationship with the first girl. And the first girl is engaged, but she's also thinking about the guy and their first relationship, and at the end he thinks he passed by her, but it's not certain. The end of the movie is similar type of ending to Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love and Happy Together. Not like the dumb Western stuff, and also not like Korean dramas. In Act 2, the whole space part is a symbolism, and you see when the guy is dreaming he's always dreaming of being with a faceless girl who is the first girl, but the interesting part is in those dreams they always seem to be on another planet looking back on Earth. And that's a symbolism that he's dreaming and thinking of something that will never happen. It's something that's out of his reach and grasp. It's an unrealistic dream and hope that won't happen, and it's out of his power. Sort of like people who dream beyond their reach, and that's why that girl in the second act that has a crush on him, she was going to tell him her feelings, but once they both saw the rocket take off to space and they were looking at it and she noticed how he was fixated on it, she realized that all this time, he was never really in the moment, and he was never really in the moment when he's with her, because his mindset was like that of humans going out into space, always trying to hunt and reach and search for something that's out of our reach. And that's when she realized her crush and feelings for him is similar to where he's out of her reach too, so she decided not to tell him anymore. By the third act, he's grown up now, but he feels like he's become numb to life. Just setting for his job, his lifestyle, his current relationship that he's not very into. He wants more in his life and to keep searching, and even if it's out of reach, but he's settling, and it was making him unhappy and numb, and his first relationship was still haunting him all these years, so he decided to quit and break up with his girlfriend. His first girlfriend meanwhile was also going through the same emotions all this time, and at the end he thinks maybe he passed by her, we don't really know, and he's not sure too. Then he turns around, looks at the crossing again, and as the train goes by they play that song one more time about being haunted by our memories and yearning for one more chance. Then the train goes by and she's not there, and you see on his face initially a sadness. However, if you notice after a while when he turns around his face changes to a calm peaceful face as he turns around to leave. It's as if he's coming to peace with the situation and trying to accept it. It's very similar to Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love, where at the end Tony Leung goes back to visit Maggie Cheung's old place they used to live in. He brought a gift over pretending like he wanted to just say hi to the previous landlady, but he secretly wanted to go back to see Maggie Cheung, but the old landlady isn't there anymore and the current tenant. A guy tells him that there's a single woman and her child living next door, and the camera closes up on Tony Leung's face and he was sad at first. And his face suddenly smiles a bit in acceptance, cause he understands that she preferred not to contact him even though it means she'll be a single mom. So he accepts that. Then at the end he goes to an abandoned temple in Cambodia and whispers into a hole in the wall to let his emotions and feelings go, then he can move on. It's the same in Happy Together. So yeah, 5 centimeters is pretty brilliant, much like a Wong Kar-wai film, although I think in 5 centimeters he was more accepting of his current state, that he may be forever haunted by these memories, hence that look at Peaky, that it's something he'll have to live with, so he'll have to live with the fact of these haunting memories and be at peace with that. But with In the Mood for Love and Happy Together it's more coming to terms and moving on totally. Another Shinkai film I liked is Voices from a Distant Star, which is a short sci-fi drama romance film about the future. 2 youth who are sort of in love and one of them has to go out into space really far away to fight a robot cyborg Gundam style war. And they have how many light years between them? And they are still trying to communicate with each other even though the messages will reach each other like way later cause of the distance. And another Shinkai film that is pretty good is Garden of Words. It's more of a short contemplative look on the dynamics of loneliness and love. Cause the film was like a dismantling of love in the traditional sense. In ancient concept the term for love was gube. Garden of Words basically took this ancient term and concept of love and dismantled it. Cause gu means loneliness and bei means sadness. So Garden of Words is more a metaphor and breakdown of that. So it contemplates rather than tell a plot. To love is to be alone, and to love is to miss, and to love is to have sadness. And for Studio Ghibli films I like Only Yesterday a lot. Love the opening piano theme. Has a strong 1980s vibe. When she just arrived to the countryside town and the guy was picking her up at the station and they were driving through the town was drawn so beautifully. There was also that one scene in the movie where she was thinking back when she was young. And her first crush, the baseball player. And she remembers seeing him standing there in the street in the distance looking at her. And cause it's her memory, so the background is mostly white since it's hazy. However, the boy and the lighting around him was this intense orange-red. Such beautiful imagery and metaphor about how we bring up our memories. The outside borders are hazy but the subject and emotion is vivid and powerful and lucid. This anime has the depth of a great film. Just they chose to use anime as a medium. It's like this with most Takahata Isao anime films. But yet, that's what sets the high-level films apart from the average. The movie touches on so many things on so many levels. It's a coming-of-age story, also a story about soul-searching when your life has reached a crossroads. Takahata Isao normally deals with more modern-day themes in his stuff. Only Yesterday, Grave of the Fireflies, Jirinko Chia the Brat, My Neighbors the Yamadas, those are all Takahata Isao. I don't like the Miyazaki films as much because although more popular due to their fantasy elements and merchandising potential, I find them not to have as much depth as the Isao films. The old-style movie making before it got more sophisticated was also more plot-driven, like the old suspense and thriller types are normally always a traditional murder mystery than noir type stuff. They bring you through a plot and then you find out what happened at the end. Movie industries usually start out making these types of movies because they are less costly to make. However, by the 1960s there's more character drive, more in-depth stories in films like the Arthurs films of the 60s and 70s by Ingmar Bergman or Jean-Luc Godard or François Truffaut, and that's also why I'm not a big fan of Korean movies, because as I mentioned before they are new to filmmaking, so most of their films are still stuck in that early stage of thrillers and suspense type stuff. So I guess you've been watching a lot of films these days then? Yes, but there's a couple of things that bother me. First thing is when I watch movies in bed I want to be comfortable, and I've been thinking about changing my bed sheets to something higher quality. Only thing is when companies market bed sheets they market it by thread count, but actually with thread counts it becomes a marketing gimmick when it's above 600 threads or so. And companies advertise using Egyptian cotton even when the cotton might not actually be from Egypt. In fact, the maximum amount of high-quality Egyptian cotton you can fit in 1 square inch is 800 threads, so that means if a brand is advertising more than 800 threads per inch then that is probably not authentic Egyptian cotton. For regular cotton, since its fibers are thicker, I think 600 is max, but Egyptian cotton is finer. And also have to make sure the cotton is certified by the Egyptian Cotton Association to make sure it's genuine. Of course it all depends on what the use case is. For clothing I like Pima and Sukuma cotton. Rayon bamboo or lyocell is cheaper and less warm although cooler for the summer and more breathable. Linen beddings is also very high quality although more expensive. Cause linen fiber is even longer than Egyptian cotton, and generally the longer the fiber the better the quality and the better the softness and durability. Authentic long staple Egyptian cotton fiber is longer and more narrow than other cotton fibers, which is why it's so premium. A lot of linen sheets are known to be heirloom type quality and like cotton will get softer after each wash. Cotton in general should soften the more you wash them, and my old bamboo and cotton blend sheets got softer and softer after each wash and lasted me 10 years and never pilled at all. The bamboo softness is nice too, but at the same time I'm always worried my skin will snag the soft bamboo and cause pilling. But yeah, 400 thread count is a more reliable number, and most of those more expensive Egyptian cotton sheets from more boutique brands are around 400 to 500 thread count, I find, because physically it's impossible to fit 1000 cotton threads in a square inch. The only way to get 1000 threads is to take low quality fibers and split them and then intertwine them, and the end result is a lower quality product cause it's just low quality fibers split and THRN intertwined to inflate the number. For single ply high quality fibers, fabric experts say the absolute max you can fit for regular cotton is 600 threads, and for Egyptian the absolute maximum is 700 to 800 threads. And another thing is the thread count being higher is not always better, because the higher the thread count the less breathable it is, but if it's less than 200 threads it's garbage and won't last long and will feel rough. 400 to 500 threads per square inch should be the optimal thread count for cotton bed sheets. Enough to feel soft but still breathable. Another thing is the type of weave, is it sateen or percale? But I keep thinking, do I need bamboo sheets or cotton sheets? Because rayon bamboo is cheaper and is more breathable, although doesn't retain heat as well as Egyptian cotton wool. Pima cotton is nice too and a bit cheaper than Egyptian. Maybe I'll just get a bamboo and cotton blend like my old sheets and get them in a matte percale weave. Those were soft and breathable and got softer every wash and lasted me 10 years. And I have to make sure if it's Egyptian cotton I get one that's authentic and certified extra long staple cotton, cause there's a lot of fakes out there. Then for my duvet or comforter I'm deciding between goose down or duck down. Goose down has the potential to be finer than duck down, so you can attain higher fill power with goose down, and goose has the potential to be lighter and more breathable because goose down might be finer. Canadian goose live in colder climates too, so their down is probably fluffier with more warmth. And I think I would want something with at least 700 fill power, although the max duck down can get to is around 700 or 750 fill power. To get to 850 fill power or more has to be goose down. That's why goose down is normally more expensive than duck down. Also the fact that duck down inherently has more oil and thus can cause an odor in the summer months when things get more humid and hotter. So I'm thinking either goose down or Hutterite duck down, because Hutterite ducks are raised to maturity before they are harvested, so their down should be pretty good. But leaning towards goose because of the potential smell from duck down in the summer. And around 700 fill power or more, so I get more warmth while also being lighter, and ideally around 400 to 600 thread count, so not sacrificing on breathability. Especially if it's sateen wave, since sateen weave is already less breathable. So 600 thread count is my upper limit already. Especially if I go for a down duvet over a bamboo one. Also for my pillow it has to be a Tempur-Pedic memory foam pillow, because that's the only brand I've used that makes real memory foam pillows that will retain the shape of your head after you use it. All the other memory foam pillows say they are memory foam but are not really using real memory foam, just regular foam, and just market it that way to get more people to buy them. So after you get just the right extra long staple certified 400 to 600 thread count Egyptian cotton bed sheets with a 700 fill power or more goose down duvet, then will you be satisfied watching your movies? No, because I still have to figure out my speakers and headphones situation. You see, although a home receiver is a nice all-in-one affordable solution for a home theater system, you lose the flexibility and potential power of home theater separates. And with separates there's less compatibility issues with my high-end speakers, which are $6,000 high-end German-made ASW speaker towers. Usually with receivers they just don't have enough power to drive my speakers, and underpowering high-end speakers like mine are more damaging to them long-term than overpowering them. The output stages for high-end separates usually have enough voltage in its output. With typical normal pre-outs in a receiver or desktop setup, it just doesn't have enough voltage in the pre-outs. I tried so many consumer-grade audiophile docks and preamps, and none of them, not even my Skiat LYR hybrid tube preamp, has a satisfactory voltage output for their pre-out stages to fully drive my speakers and amps well. Only my Emotiva Stealth DC1 DAC, which was only $400 back then, has a full analog volume stage and pro-level current. It was mainly a DAC, but its preamp function is pro-level and it outputs enough preamp voltage to totally drive my speakers and power amp, and it was just $400 back then. The volume stage of the DC1 is fully analog, which I love, but the key is the preamp section and how much current does its preamp output. No other expensive DAC amp with pre-outs that I've tried so far can even come close to properly pushing my speakers, cause my speakers are in a totally different category from regular audiophile speakers. It needs pro-level power, so the entire chain needs to be no bullshit high-level current. For example, the Marantz receiver I borrowed from you of course doesn't come close to having the power to drive the speakers. That's not possible, and we both know that, but even the preamp doesn't output enough current to properly act as a preamp for my system. I also tried a big expensive NAD preamp which cost like $1,600 and it couldn't drive my ASW speakers to their full potential. It could make sound from them but not properly, and as a preamp it's still not as good as the Emotiva DC1 Stealth, so yeah, that was just a $400 DAC, but the preamp was so pro level. Thank goodness it has analog in, so even when its USB input failed I can still use the analog in as a preamp. I've been spending the last few weeks experimenting with different combinations of my audio setup. I'm currently outputting line out from my FiiO M23 audio player to my Skiat LYR using the high gain mode of the M23, and also from this Chinese media player that I bought to my Marantz HD DAC1, and comparing the audio quality from the media player optical cable vs analog cable to my Marantz. The analog cable sounds so much better. It's the same difference as when I compared USB versus optical to my Emotiva. With that there's a clear difference. Both USB and optical are digital, so you'd think it would be the same, but the USB input on it sounds way better, like a night and day difference. It seems with the analog cable the audio is way louder after volume matching, and the analog has more treble so sounds brighter, but the optical sounds warmer and more rounded. And the cables matter too. A straight up copper cable sounds different from a silver cable versus a silver and copper braided one, and I can clearly hear the differences with my headphones. It's pretty obvious for me with the HiFiman He 1000 V2 headphones I got. Everything sounds a touch more high pitched with the silver cable, and the copper with silver plated cables sound more high pitched than pure copper cables. And with my Sennheiser HD800 headphones the OEM cables are silver, and when I bought those balanced copper cables after using those I noticed that the sound was different. The bass was a bit more boosted but less treble, less bright. Pure silver has more treble and extension, but we're talking just a few percentage difference, and my Ultralink cables have a touch more detail and dynamics than a stock Amazon cable, probably because of the silver. I don't think the prices of the cables matter as much as the materials do. Also with different media players there can be a difference too. My FiiO built-in player sounds a bit more clear and detailed with but less bass, so it sounds brighter and also a touch more dynamic. Fubar 2000 player is warmer with a touch more bass. Fubar 2000 and FiiO player both sound totally different but are good in their own way. VLC I like the least because it sounds so harsh, shrill and high-pitched. They all have a noticeable difference. So which audio components would you say make the most difference to you so far? Well, obviously the speakers and headphones first make the biggest difference, cause that's actually what you are listening to. But then after that is the source material. Is it coming from a compressed MP3? Cassettes? Vinyl? CDs? High residential FLAC files? For me, I have my entire collection of music on high residential FLAC files, preferably 24-bit and higher and 384 kHz and higher. And people who think that vinyl has more dynamic range than CDs are dead wrong. Of course there's a dynamic limit to vinyl. The cutter head that cuts the vinyl has a limit in how much dynamic range it can actually cut. It's a physical impossibility and against simple physics. And not only when cutting it, when cutting you already lose a lot of dynamic range, and then when reading it the needle and tone arm can't read with unlimited dynamic range, which is also impossible, and that's why vinyl sounds the way it does. It's warm because the treble is rolled off due to how the record is cut. The needle can't track the record perfectly, information is lost, and you have to chop off extreme frequencies, which means dynamic range during the process of making the vinyl record, cause the cutter can't cut those extreme frequencies since it will overheat the cutter. And the bass also has to be messed with when adding it onto vinyl, so yeah, it's a two-part issue with vinyl. When making the record they already have to chop away stuff on the groove, and when reading it it's also imperfect, and all those expensive turntables audiophiles buy with expensive phono cartridges and expensive phono preamps are just for the needle to be able to track the groove more accurately and read it with more detail, but even if it can read the groove perfectly it still won't match CD in dynamic range due to the inherent constraints of vinyl as a physical medium. So people who say that vinyl has more dynamic range don't realize that yes, while the frequency range of vinyl is higher than CDs due to CDs using a sampling rate, the original vinyl record had a limited dynamic range to begin with, so it's like making a lossless file converted from a lossy MP3. The original source had lost information to begin with. Vinyl was never accurate cause it lost the treble that had to be chopped away, and people just had a bad impression of CDs and digital audio because their impressions came from a time when CDs during the 1980s were transferred badly from the original master recordings, and from the 2000s when MP3s were all the rage and they were compressed to nothing, added onto the loudness wars that was already going on at that time where modern music was so heavily compressed, and yet compared to that vinyl might have better dynamic range, but compared to a properly remastered CD recording and a high residential DSD or FLAC file, no. And proof of this is when you sing into a recording microphone and listen to it from a good pair of speakers, the CDs will reproduce all the details of the singing, including the S sounds from the sibilants will come through sharp and clear, whereas in vinyl you don't hear sibilants because those high frequencies are lost. It's also how like people mistakenly believe that the Harman curve is an accurate reference sound signature when it's anything but reference. It's basically the sound signature that most mainstream people like to hear, essentially the audio equivalent of a Marvel blockbuster movie. Most people like it doesn't mean it's the reference standard. The DAC is pretty important though, like for example I'm listening to my FiiO M23 music player which has a flagship Asahi KCIA K4499X DAC inside it and has enough power to rival a desktop amp. It doesn't totally sound like the usual AKM sound, it sounds more like an S-Saber DAC and it's pretty aggressive in the highs. But isn't it about the implementation too? A DAC chip by itself doesn't have a sound until you implement it in a design. So I don't know if you can generalize the sound of a DAC chip by itself since it has to be implemented in a design first and those can all be different implementations. Well, it goes both ways, can't overgeneralize and say it's all about implementation too, especially when 99% of the stuff I've heard sounds pretty similar. Of course the DAC chip itself makes a difference, otherwise they can just use the cheapest DAC possible, so it's both. Yes, not all S sound the same. For example, the newest flagship ES9039 Pro DAC I heard from Saber sounds different. But for the most part from what I've heard, certain DAC brands have a certain sound. Each chip has a spec, right? Specs related to signal to noise ratio, specs related to total harmonic distortion, stuff like that, and they all translate to of course a difference in sound, otherwise why would they even have different DAC chips? Why have lower end docks and higher end DAC chips? Thus the same DAC chip, all other factors equal, shall sound similar. That's how we even get consistency when those chips are used in the same models. The DAC chip itself decodes the digital to analog stage and goes through the rest of the circuitry in the unit, which is the implementation. So of course while the implementation can differ, the same DAC chip should of course have consistent sonic qualities because that's how you would guarantee consistency amongst your products. You can't have a lower end DAC chip in a lower end product actually outcompete a higher end product with a higher end DAC chip, right? So we have to separate the rest of the implementation from the DAC chip. All other factors held constant, the amp stage and all that, the same DAC chips in different devices should sound similar since they have to be implemented to the same spec. Of course depending on the chip itself the manufacturer can design it to sound a certain way, like AKM designs their chips to sound warmer, hence why they call their house sound the velvet sound, and S tends to design their Saber chips to sound neutral though sometimes harsh. And then of course the circuit designer can tweak the implementation to sound however they want after that, but DAC chips do have an inherent sound built into them. In fact 99% of all S-Saber products I heard had this unnaturalness with elevated treble, with the only exception being the FiiO K19 I heard. The K19 sounded a bit S but more refined. But otherwise I didn't like most S docks, it sounded unnatural, kind of like using EQ software, which I generally avoid because it sounds artificial and unnatural. I always turn off any high pass or low pass filters, keep the EQ flat, and I always turn on the direct or pure mode if they have such an option. The best way to compare DACs is just to use a true line out to go into the same amp, like how I was comparing the DAC from the FiiO M23 to my Emotiva DC1 and the Marantz HD DAC1, so that they use the exact same preamp stage, which is the DAC part. And I checked the M23's line out from the single-ended output is 2 volts, which isn't bad, but I would have preferred a higher voltage so that affects the quality of the sound coming out of the DAC. A standalone desktop DAC amp should have a slightly higher line out voltage. The M23 has good output power, 760 MW with hi-fi boost mode on and 1000 MW with super high gain mode, though it needs to be plugged in for that, and has pretty good detail, but there's that slight treble boost that bled into the upper mids to give it an elevated sense of detail. The voices were a bit strange and the drum hits were distracting like S normally is, and it sounded more like S than AKM, but then I remembered there was a low pass filter turned on and it wasn't in high gain mode, and once I turned those on it's more smoother and natural and sounded more like my Emotiva DAC. And on that stupid audio science forum where everyone is brainwashed by that cult leader Amir and hangs onto his every word when he doesn't know what he's talking about at all his reviews are bogus and nonsense. He judges components solely by his flawed metrics and measurements, compares frequency response to the Harman curve, which like I said isn't reference, and people on those forums say stupid shit like cables don't make a difference because they all measure the same, docks don't make a difference, differences in sound are all in your head and doesn't exist, etc. And they push that stupid Apple dongle which sounds terrible to people. And they adamantly believe everything, and the way they write their comments is so condescending, like Amir is always right, they are always 100% right, and everyone else are the blind and dumb ones, yet they have no logic or proof to back anything up. And whenever there is someone who comes out with evidence that goes against them, like when this one professor from South Carolina came out with a paper that proved cables do make a measurable difference, then Amir discredits him, saying his testing methods were flawed. Well, how do we know the way Amir tests isn't flawed? When has he ever published a paper? When has he ever been a speaker at an audio engineers event? What makes people think Amir is so credible and everyone else isn't? They just blindly believe everything that guy says. Like someone on that forum said, it's just a bunch of components doing its job, it's not something magical that changes the sound. That's so stupid. I can say the same thing about cars or headphones or anything. It's just a bunch of components doing their job, there's nothing magical going on here. And another guy saying docks don't affect soundstage. Well, soundstage is part of the sound and people think it's something mystical, but it's part of the sound, and when you change some frequency responses then perceived soundstage will change too along with other aspects of the sound. And yes, amplifiers have differences in sound too because more power opens up the soundstage and can increase dynamics and clarity. And can be tuned to sound brighter or warmer or neutral, like for example Marantz often tunes their docks to sound warm. There are things that are measurable and things that aren't. Yes, frequency response and power output and distortion are all measurable. Soundstage and detail retrieval and imaging are not, because these are aspects of sound quality perceived by the human brain which a machine cannot accurately tell you. Tube amps are desirable because people want the coloration even if they don't measure well. That's something those audio science review guys will never understand, since in their world everything that measures badly like tube amps thus isn't fit for listening. Audio science review reviews components based on a Klippel near field scanner. They don't use human ears, and that's why all the stuff they recommend like Rebel speakers, Genelec speakers, topping amps measure all well and good, but they don't sound musical, because what is musical or not is not determined by a machine but determined by human ears, and that's what those people are missing. They act all high and mighty and condescending with their responses, but they actually know nothing and have no logic. It's illogical to say amps shouldn't affect the sound or docks all sound the same, because what's the chance all these different products with tons of different components inside, different resistors, capacitors, transistors, different power, different voltage, how can they all come out sounding the same? It's impossible and illogical. But yeah, these audio science review guys are a religious cult. They are brainwashed. They're acting like gatekeepers, saying people who can hear a difference are the fools, but maybe it's them who don't have good ears or don't have a revealing enough system. Amir just posts a graph and calls it a day. He's not qualified at all to review audio products. He's not using or interpreting data correctly or understands the measurements and how they can or can't affect sound, and has no ear for listening, so he doesn't understand as much as he claims. Any dumbass who doesn't know the difference between reference sounding and Harman curve isn't qualified to review audio. You can like the Harman curve but don't call it the reference like he does. Amir believes the Harman curve is an absolute neutral reference and acts like a headphone is defective if it doesn't sound like the Harman curve, and because so many people online believe these guys, the level of misinformation is amplified. Kind of like how popular video game reviewers like IGN and GameSpot have no idea what they are talking about cause they are casuals who just play the game on easy mode and call it a day and get on to the next game. They gave Aliens Fireteam 7 out of 10 because they played it on easy mode and then it got too repetitive for them, or like a Dragon 7 out of 10 because there was that difficulty spike later in the game. Shows how casual they are. Or Rotten Tomatoes critics who will give a movie high marks for being diverse and woke and not actually analyze what's going on in a movie. Or Bleacher Report who just allows any random high school kid to post about basketball stuff when he has no qualifications to talk about it. Even ESPN analysts have no idea what they are talking about. They just say if a guy scores a lot then he had a good game, and if he didn't score a lot then he needs to improve. Team who won good and team who lost needs to improve. What kind of analysis is that? That's why the best analysts in sports are usually the coaches and former role players, cause they actually understand the game and what's going on. Even superstars like Shaq and Barkley can have really bad takes because they are too focused on getting their stats rather than seeing the big picture like role players and coaches do. Real journalism is dead and has been dead ever since social media took over. But yet I would say the order of importance is the end component, which is headphones or speakers, then the source material, then I would say acoustic room treatment and room correction matters of course, and then the DAC circuit, then amplifier topology, then cables and interconnects, then sound isolation technology like anti-vibration plinths, platters and feet. All of this makes a difference in how you perceive sound.